Chapter 403. In the warm pen, too, men had higher body temperatures than women in the first place. Once Chu Lian had gotten close to this heat source, she subconsciously wanted to get even closer. It was all part of her natural instincts. In order to hug her heat source tight, one of her legs even found its way onto He Sanlang's body. The cool-faced He Changdi looked down at Chu Lian for a moment as his body stiffened up. After some time, he simply let her do as she liked. The two of them were each down to a single layer of clothing now, which was made of a thin material. He Sanlang had one arm under Chu Lian's neck, while the other circled around her slender waist. Chu Lian was exhaling warm puffs of air around He Changda's collarbone. One of her hands had subconsciously curled around the collar of He Changda's shirt, like she trusted and relied on him. The couple were stuck close to each other without any gaps between them. He Sanlang's cool mask had melted a little by now. When his arms were filled with Chu Lian's presence, it felt as if his heart was full too. Hidden from Chu Lian's view, He Changdi sighed lightly in satisfaction and shut his eyes, as if he was about to join Chu Lian in slumber. He hadn't rested for a very long time in order to look for Chu Lian. His nerves had been tightly wound up all the while until she had finally returned to his arms again, so he was rather tired by now. His eyelids slowly slid shut, and he was just about to fall asleep when Chu Lian suddenly moved. She wriggled as if trying to burrow deeper into his embrace. It seemed like her current position wasn't too comfortable, and she wanted to change into a better one. After Chu Lian moved, He Changdi completely lost all traces of sleepiness. He loosened his hold on her and let Chu Lian shift into a more comfortable position. Once she had fallen back into deep slumber, he slowly tightened his arms around her again, keeping her safe and secure in his embrace. However, after all that movement, He Sanlang didn't feel like sleeping any longer. He sighed helplessly and stared blankly at his surroundings while hugging Chu Lian. After a short moment, He Changdi started to feel that something wasn't quite right. His expression changed and his ears started to flush red. While Chu Lian was ensconced in his arms, she was breathing out directly over his Adam's apple. The warm puffs of her breaths were making his mouth dry. He had been too worried earlier to think about how intimate their actions were. Now that he had calmed down, everything that had escaped his notice earlier was standing out. It was hard for him to ignore it again. Since the two of them were bundled so tightly together and wearing thin clothing, he could feel the softness of her chest on his. The palm that he had placed on Chu Lian's waist suddenly felt burning hot. He completely froze up, not daring to make the slightest bit of movement. He forcefully adjusted his breathing, trying to make himself calm down. He Sanlang's tall body was now tensed up like a drawn bow. A bow that was already pulled to its limits and about to shoot at any moment with all its stored energy. The sleeping Chu Lian just had to start getting restless at this moment. He Sanlang had been tensing his body in restraint due to the strange sensations overcoming his body. Thus, he had lost control over the strength of his arms, which turned into tight bars around Chu Lian. Chu Lian wanted to escape the uncomfortably tight hold around her, so she started to wriggle. She rubbed her body against He Changdi's and let out an uncomfortable moan. It was then that He Changdi finally realized that he was crushing her. He let go of her in panic, a light blush dyeing his handsome face pink. Chu Lian wriggled a few more times before realizing that the uncomfortable bindings around her had disappeared. She smacked her lips and slipped back into peaceful slumber. He Changdi's body remained stiff for a long time after that. It wasn't until Chu Lian stopped moving that he finally dared to move. The pen's surface area was small, so there was only so much space for them to sleep on. Afraid that she would still be affected by the cold, He Changdi could only attempt to hug Chu Lian once again, but more carefully this time. He reached out towards her under the blanket and wrapped his arm around Chu Lian's waist. However, in the next second, what his fingers touched wasn't soft and smooth fabric, but something soft and warm. His body froze up once again. This time, his whole face turned a bright lobster red. The thoughts that he had managed to suppress earlier came flooding back into his mind. Chu Lian's earlier movements had caused her clothes to unravel a little, revealing some of the smooth skin around her waist. He Sanlang wanted to remove his scorching hot palm from Chu Lian's bare skin, but it was stuck and he couldn't move it at all. Although Chang's expression remained as cool as usual, the raging blush on his face revealed his inner turmoil. He gulped a mouthful of saliva with difficulty. He looked down at the woman in his arms. Her lips were currently formed into a pout, and her hair was slightly messy. A few strands had fallen over her flushed cheeks, right under her eyes. Her cute little nose was twitching slightly. Sanlang's gaze couldn't help but follow the line of her nose down to Chu Lian's slightly parted red lips. He pressed his dry lips together. His face moved closer to her, inch by inch, until he could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. At this point, he forced himself to stop. Changdi was fighting a massive battle in his heart. His breathing became more hurried. In the end, he could no longer hold himself back, and he placed a light kiss on Chu Lian's soft lips. The palm resting at her waist glided over her skin before moving upwards in a very natural movement. He still remembered the heavenly softness that had been pressed against his hard chest earlier, tempting him to lose control of himself. Chapter 404. Together in the pen, 2. Scorching heat flared up in Chang's palm, making him feel like he was burning up. The feel of the smooth skin under his fingers was intoxicating. He couldn't pull away even if he wanted to. Sanlang kissed Chu Lian gently. His breathing became hurried. For some reason, those obscene drawings that Xiao Hongyu had kept in their tent suddenly floated up into his mind. His hands were already slowly climbing up to the soft peaks on Chu Lian's chest. A strange feeling washed over him when he finally reached that new land. Every fiber of his being drew taut with tension. He swallowed hard. Even though his expression was as cool as ever, his eyes had darkened into fathomless pools. Changdi had always been more aloof than most. Due to the tragedy he had experienced in his past life, his personality had become even more stoic and unfeeling. It was hard to move the heart of someone like that. However, the moment they fell in love, they fell hard. Sanlang stared at Chu Lian with eyes as deep as the star-filled skies above. He was uncomfortably tensed all over and his mouth was dry. The hand he had placed over that soft lump finally started moving a little. That novel sensation finally pushed Sanlang over the edge of no return. He had never known that his wife's body was so soft to the touch. Compared to her, he was hard all over and definitely not as nice to touch. He was really a dumb rock of a man. Chang's neck was also slowly turning red. Despite that, he continued maintaining a cool and aloof expression on his face. Only the heavens knew how excited and stirred up he was inside. His long black eyelashes trembled as his eyes focused on the unconscious Chu Lian. The movement of his hand paused as well. However, he couldn't bear to let go of that amazingly plush feeling under his palm, so he kept it there and even spread his fingers to dominate the whole area. After freezing for an agonizing few seconds and making sure that Chu Lian was still sleeping and had no consciousness of what he was doing, his palms started moving again. Now that he was reassured that she hadn't woken up, he became even bolder. He gently kneaded the area under his hand before realizing that he wanted even more. Finally, he let go of his restraint and reached his entire hand in to cover her breast. As if testing it out, he pinched the entire handful before groping it. He found a little nub standing out from the rest of the smooth skin under his palm. Sanlang's lips were already pressed into a thin line. Sweat had started appearing on his palms. After a slight pause, he reached out with one finger to touch that raised spot in the middle. It seemed like that area was too sensitive and couldn't withstand any sort of teasing. It started changing rapidly. The natural reaction from Chu Lian's body acted like a catalyst, causing a strange sensation to arise from Sanlang's own body. In the dimly lit warm pen, the lantern hung on the side swayed with the movement of the snowboat, casting a warm and romantic light over the tiny little pen. Even a man as aloof as Sanlang wouldn't be able to keep an iron hold over his control when faced with the woman he liked. Furthermore, Chu Lian was his lawfully wedded wife. It was only natural for a husband to be intimate with his wife. Now that Sanlang had found an excuse for his lapse of control, his movements became even bolder. It wasn't enough for him to cope a feel with his hand alone now. He wanted to see exactly what he was touching. His eyes glanced down at Chu Lian's pale face, touched with a flush of red. He pulled his rebellious hand out from her clothes reluctantly. He left another gentle kiss on Chu Lian's forehead before he reached towards the ties, keeping her clothes together. Shifting back a little gave him more space to maneuver about, so that one of his hands could work to undo the ties on Chu Lian's inner clothing. Perhaps due to his nerves or his sense of urgency, he wasn't able to untie her clothes no matter how much he tried. Not only that, since he had pulled hard at the ties in a fit of frustration, the originally loose knot had turned into a dead one. The tips of He Sanlang's ears turned even redder, and his breathing turned into heavy pants. In the end, he lost all patience and used his internal energy to break the tie completely. He Changda's gaze landed on the sliver of fair skin exposed from the loose collar of Chu Lian's clothes, where her pretty collarbones stood out under her slender neck. His eyes slid further downwards to the area where his hand had wandered to. Her clothes were still keeping everything under wraps, but the pressure of lying down sideways had pushed the two round buns on her chest together, making an enticing valley. He Sanlang picked up one side of her inner robe with his fingers. His Adam's apple bobbed as he gulped hard. The halter top that Chu Lian wore as underwear had become skewed from his movements earlier. Despite his usual blockhead appearance, He Changdi simply untied the strings at the back and gently tossed it to one side without any pause. Thus, the soft and tender buns that had just been in his palm were revealed to his sight. His gaze was now affixed to Chu Lian's chest. Looking at them was completely different from holding them blindly in his hand. The visual impact caused He Sanlang's body to tense up to its maximum. He had never thought that the two little buns on Chu Lian's chest would be so cute. He was almost trembling with how taut he was holding his body. Although he knew he shouldn't, he couldn't restrain himself anymore. He reached out to rub one of the soft peaks. The moment his fingers touched her smooth skin, he couldn't hold back his strength. His slightly cool lips rained kisses on Chu Lian's forehead, then her nose, as he headed further downwards. He Changdi was completely immersed in enjoying the sensations overwhelming his body. The one thing he couldn't have expected was Chu Lian waking right this moment. Chapter 405. Together in the pen, 2. Deep in her slumber, Chu Lian had started feeling her body warming over once again. However, at some point in time, her chest had started feeling uncomfortable. She had been able to bear with the pressure on her chest at first, but later on, it had gotten stronger and stronger until she wanted to escape from that overbearing feeling. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes fluttered open blearily as she woke up from the pain of having her chest groped hard. Who could have thought that she would be met with such an awkward scene the moment her vision cleared up? She was stunned still for a second before rage bubbled up from within her. The slender leg that had been thrown over He Sanlang's body immediately retracted and delivered a swift and merciless kick. Chu Lian had used every bit of strength she could summon from her body. Even a strong man like He Sanlang was pushed away by the force of Chu Lian's kick. He rolled out of the blanket, a wretched sight to behold. He Sanlang was abruptly woken from his fit of euphoria. A crack appeared in his cool expression as he directed a disbelieving look at Chu Lian. After getting kicked at by Chu Lian, his arousal had faded away. Little brother, he likely wouldn't be able to get up to any mischief for the moment. His left hand was still curled up as if cradling something, so anyone could tell that he had been up to no good. Chu Lian looked down, only to see that half of her chest was exposed. A furious blush lit up on her cheeks. She finally understood what had been happening just now, and what He Sanlang had been doing to her while she was unconscious. Anger swelled up in her heart. She quickly pulled up her clothes, covering up the little bun that was slightly reddened from all the groping. She was filled to the point of bursting with fury, which all came out in an angry roar. He Changdi, when did you become so shameless? He had actually taken advantage of her while she was unconscious. He had even touched her there, and it had been so painful that there were likely marks left on her skin. Was this still the same cold and stoic lunatic He Sanlang? In the midst of her rage, tears had welled up in Chu Lian's wide eyes. Despite the fiery light in them, she didn't look the slightest bit imposing while glaring at He Changdi. Instead, she looked like a bullied puppy. He Sanlang was stunned while staring into Chu Lian's eyes. In the next moment, He actually clambered back up expressionlessly and returned to Chu Lian's side. He lifted the fox fur cloak covering her, trying to burrow back into the pile of blankets. This was completely out of Chu Lian's expectations. She didn't think that He Sanlang would be so shameless as to return without any sort of shame in his expression at all. Her fury climbed to new heights. What was this lunatic He Sanlang trying to do? Chu Lian's brows drew together, and she tried to voice an enraged shout. He San Lang. However, Chu Lian's voice was naturally tender and pleasant to the ears. She didn't seem threatening in the least, let alone in this situation. Conversely, she was the very picture of a frazzled little kitten who had just been bullied and was trying to threaten someone by showing off her fluffy little claws. However, those tiny kitten claws probably wouldn't even leave a mark if she tried using them on someone. He Sanlang reached out with one long arm and captured her immediately, stuffing her back into the nest of blankets in one smooth movement as if her struggles were nothing. The doctor said that you have to keep warm. You can't let your body get chilled again. Lie down first. Chu Lian's chest was still hurting. This darned He Sanlang didn't know how to control his strength. She wanted to object to his order, but she didn't have the physical strength to do so, so she could only let him wrap her up in the warm blankets again. You little. Do you remember where you were before? Although there was the usual cool cast to He Sanlang's handsome features, his husky and magnetic voice had become softer. Before Chu Lian could start chewing him out, he had cut in with his question. That one question pulled Chu Lian's thoughts away from her rage. That's right. Chu Lian blinked. How had she woken up in this warm place with her lunatic husband next to her? Hadn't she been hiding with Yuri Han in a horse's belly in the middle of the snowy plains? She had been trembling so hard from the cold that she thought she wouldn't be able to make it. Had He Sanlang found her? Chu Lian's moist eyes widened in surprise. She found it hard to imagine how He Changdi had managed to find her out on that inhospitable swath of snow-covered ground. What kind of dangers had he faced in order to get to her? She had still been in the horse's belly then. Do you remember now? He Sanlang asked gently. Chu Lian nodded, looking rather shaken. She had been in precarious situations twice now, ever since she had come to this world. Each time, it had been He Changdi who had saved her in the nick of time, while her life had been dangling on a thread. She wasn't made of stone. Of course, she felt something for him in return. So He Changdi actually cared for her that much? When He Sanlang saw that Chu Lian had slipped into a daze, a wave of relief swept over his heart, though his outer expression remained unchanged. That had been way too awkward just now. It was bad enough that he had lost control over himself, but he had actually gotten caught by Chu Lian. Luckily, he had changed the topic in a quick turn of wit, otherwise the wicked woman would probably have annoyed him for a long time over this matter. He continued hugging Chu Lian and stroked her back gently, as if he were soothing a puffed-up little kitten. However, after finishing 2 comforting strokes, his hand couldn't help but twitch. The sensation of touching those buns still remained on his palm and had yet to fade away. Chapter 406. You look more handsome, 1. Chu Lian looked up at the man embracing her. Although the lighting was dim, she could see his features clearly. He Sanlang didn't look as handsome as his usual self. Right now, he looked more like a normal man worried about his wife. His face had an unhealthy pallor to it, and he was starting to look like a panda. Even stubble had started growing on his chin. However, he didn't look disheveled or unkempt. Instead, those marks of fatigue gave him the charisma of a mature man. She had to mention it again. He Sanlang's looks were really top-notch. Although his brilliant and heroic features weren't as popular as Xiao Bojian's in this era, He Changdi was the better-looking out of the two in Chu Lian's heart. As Chu Lian looked up at him with her wide eyes, the back of He Sanlang's ears were slowly turning red and his expression was becoming a little stiff. His icy tone resounded in the small space as he spoke, a hint of awkwardness present in his voice. What are you looking at? Chu Lian replied without thinking, looking at you. He Changdi hadn't expected such a frank statement from her. A blush immediately spread down his neck in reaction. He turned his face away stiffly as his eyes darted to and fro until they finally landed on the roof of the pin. When Chu Lian glanced at him and noticed that his entire neck was now red, She stared in stunned surprise. He Changdi was actually embarrassed. Had he always been so sensitive? Sanling resisted the urge to squirm under Chu Lian's probing gaze and reacted by covering up her inquisitive eyes with his hand. His voice was slightly husky as he said, "Stop looking, there's nothing to see here. Go to sleep." Considering what she had woken up to, Chu Lian didn't dare to actually fall asleep again. Who knew what her lunatic husband was going to do if she fell asleep this time? Even though Chu Lian hadn't brought up the topic, it didn't mean that she had really forgotten about what had just happened. She just felt that it was too awkward and she wasn't brave enough to mention it. One side of her chest was still throbbing a little in pain. That damned Sanling. She tried her best to hold back her question, but she ended up asking anyway. "Are you going to be here as well?" "I'm fine now." The hint in her words was that she was already perfectly well, and he should move along with his own business. His presence would be disturbing her rest. Changdi still had some smarts left in that head of his. He instantly understood the meaning behind Chu Lian's words. His expression turned slightly stormy. Any husband who had just been disdained by his wife would probably react the same. "There aren't enough warm pins, and we have too many people in our party. Some of the other pins are packed with up to 5 people." Chu Lian bit her lip. She had no choice here. Changdi had actually managed to corner her with his words. He had a point. If she really threw him out at this time, wouldn't his brothers laugh at him? It would be hard to explain why he wanted to squeeze in with the other guys instead of staying with his wife. Chu Lian lamented her misfortune inwardly and gave up. They were married anyway, and she didn't actually dislike Sanling. On the contrary, she might even have taken a liking to him somewhere deep in her heart. There wasn't really anything in the way of them becoming husband and wife in truth, rather than just in name. Chu Lian showed him a faint frown. "Then you had better behave yourself." Sanling's expression had somewhat relaxed after Chu Lian hadn't taken him to task for his misdeeds. The moment she brought up the elephant in the room, his handsome face lit up in a spectacular blush once again. He gulped hard. Even his fingers felt rather stiff from all the tension in him. It was only after a long pause that he finally managed to give a response. "Sleep? I won't move at all." Chu Lian shot a doubtful glance at him before grunting lightly in agreement. From the way she wrapped her clothes tightly around herself, it was clear that she didn't trust in Changdi's weak self-control. She was about to shut her eyes when she abruptly remembered Yurihan and her sons. "What about the people who were lying in the horses with me?" Sanling shifted the cloaks and fleeces covering the two of them and made sure that Chu Lian's entire body was properly shielded from the cold. "They're in another warm pen. Don't worry, there's a doctor looking after them. They'll be fine." Upon hearing that her companions were safe, Chu Lian sighed in relief and finally let herself relax fully. She looked up at Changdi. He seemed to have recovered from his blush and was now back to the normal calm and cool-headed Sanling. However, when she looked closer at his narrow, upturned eyes, she could still detect a well-hidden trace of tenderness in their depths. Chu Lian blinked. Sanling, did you find out who did all this?" The question made Sanling's sharp brows lift a little. He didn't like how Chu Lian had addressed him. After a slight pause, he cast a searching gaze downwards at the woman curled up between his arms, as if trying to see through her thoughts. "What do you think?" The space between Chu Lian's brows wrinkled as she thought seriously. Her face was like an open book. All of her thoughts and emotions could be read just by looking at her. Those kidnappers couldn't possibly have been sent by Xiaobojian, right? Chu Lian's words sent a ripple of shock through Changdi. His pupils constricted. He met Chu Lian's innocent gaze with a grave expression. "Why would you think so?" Chapter 407. "You look more handsome, too." A corner of Chu Lian's mouth tilted downwards. She spoke honestly, as if she hadn't noticed the doubts in Sanling's eyes. "I think that there's something wrong with his mind. He keeps pestering me. You saw how he was like on the way we went back to the Ying estate. Later on, he even tried to meet me at Deffing Tea House on the basis of being acquainted in the past, but I rejected him. He's my grandfather's favorite pupil, and he entered the Imperial Academy after just half a year of examinations, so he has some smarts. I'm afraid he's not someone to be trifled with." Although she hadn't revealed some details in her complaints, everything she had said was true. Chu Lian had read the original story before, and she knew that Xiao Bojian wasn't a good man. She had decided to draw the boundaries with him when she had arrived in the Great Wu dynasty. Of course, she wouldn't let He Changdi have any misunderstandings of the relationship between her and Xiao Bojian. She wasn't the original wicked woman, Chu Lian. She wasn't the one who was hellbent on loving Xiao Bojian and wanted to keep her body pure for him even after marrying someone else. Chu Lian knew that He Changdi likely already knew about everything she had just told him. Why else had he sent Wenqing and Wanlan to serve her? Just because she hadn't mentioned it outright didn't mean that she was completely oblivious to what was going on. She knew that senior servant Zhong would add a letter for He Changdi every time they sent letters to the northern border troops. Even if she had never read those letters before, she could guess at their contents. They were most likely reports about her. Her goal had always been to be a layabout. As long as she had good food and enough money to live on, she would be perfectly happy. With her sister-in-law, Madame Zhou, around, she didn't even need to manage the household and she could just spend her time having fun. Thus, she had been too lazy to bother with controlling senior servant Zhong and the one sister's surveillance of her. He Sanlang clearly hadn't expected Chu Lian to be complaining about Xiao Bojian. When she had been talking about him, He Sanlang had been able to feel how much she disliked him from the disdain in her expression alone. His brows wrinkled for a bit before he broke out into a sudden smile. I didn't know that you thought of Mr. Xiao that way. You've really surprised me there. Don't you know that Xiao Bojian has been the ideal lover of many of the noble ladies around even back in the Imperial College? He Changdi wasn't exaggerating at all. If Chu Lian had been able to see for herself the carnage at Xiao Bojian's victory parade after he had become the top scholar, she would probably have marveled at the ladies going crazy over him. Back then, it had been raining flowers all over. The girls on either side of the road had tossed flower petals at the top scholar sitting atop a horse. The streets that Xiao Bojian had passed had been left strewn with so many flower petals that they formed a thick carpet. Chu Lian was already numb to the strange and abnormal aesthetics of the Great Wu dynasty. She rolled her eyes hard and almost cringed as her imagination brought up an image of Xiao Bojian's feminine face, all dolled up with a huge flower tucked into his hair, wearing his bright red scholar's robe and parading about town. The corners of her lips twitched. In my eyes, you're much better looking than he is. It was He Sanlang's turn to freeze in shock. He pressed his lips together. He wanted to ask if she meant it, but he just couldn't bring himself to ask. In the end, He Sanlang took a deep breath to calm the repressed yet happy feelings within him and told her the truth. It was him. Xiao Bojian is in Sioux City right now. Chu Lian's response was to open her eyes as wide as they could go to show her disbelief. Xiao Bojian was in Sioux City? Going by the original story, Xiao Bojian and He Changdi didn't get along in the first place. Did that mean that they had already crossed swords in Sioux City? He Sanlang had successfully brought supplies back to camp. It was clear who had won their first duel. Chu Lian suddenly felt a burst of pride. Although her husband was a little crazy sometimes, he was still pretty strong when it came to fighting. She wanted to add something else, but He Sanlang patted her back lightly. His voice was still husky as he prompted her. It's late. Hurry up and go sleep. Chu Lian swallowed her words and agreed. She had been kidnapped suddenly and taken away to that hill where she spent all night trying to think of a way to escape. Luckily, the sneak attack she had suffered in that forest the last time had increased her caution. From then on, she had always kept some drugs on her all the time. Once she had drugged those kidnappers and taken Yuri Han and her sons away, they had spent a whole day traveling through windy and snowy plains. Later on, they had killed the horses and hidden inside their bellies for warmth. After a whole day and night of tumultuous events, Chu Lian had already gone past the limit of her body and she was extremely fatigued. If not for He Sanlang and his excessive use of force, she wouldn't have woken up at all. The feeling of He Changdi's gentle pats on her back brought her back to her childhood, when her mother had held her in her arms and soothed her to sleep with pats. The sleepiness she had been holding back rushed back into her mind immediately. In less than a minute, Chu Lian had already slipped back into slumber, as evidenced by her long and shallow breaths. He Sanlang cast his gaze down at her, scanning Chu Lian's young features with unreadable depths. He hugged the slender body in his arms more tightly and sighed. In his past life, Yuri Han had saved him, So he had come looking for her family earlier in this life. He had given them some necessary supplies for winter. Later on, there had been too many military matters at hand keeping him busy until the war with the two Huns started. He hadn't had any time to check on Yuri-Han and her sons at all. He hadn't expected her to appear at this time, and for her to have saved his wife. Fate worked in strange ways. It was as if the hidden strings of destiny had already connected all these events together. Although the events seemed like random coincidences, it felt like they were simply following predestined paths. Chapter 408. Take good care of your wife. 1. A thread of anxiety flickered in He-Sanlang. It felt as if his heated body had cooled instantly. He subconsciously hugged the warm and soft woman in his arms more tightly, as that seemed to be the only way he could feel reassured. Yuri-Han and her sons were fine. After eating some food and resting for the whole night in a warm pen, their spirits were better than ever. By the time Chu Lian woke up again, she realized that it was already the afternoon of the next day. She curled up a little and rubbed at her sleepy eyes. The natural furnace that had been keeping her warm was already gone. Her body shook a little to warm up from the cold, and she quickly became alert. Just as she was about to sit up and call for someone, the curtain that worked as a door for the warm pen shifted. Changdi used only one arm to push himself into the warm pen. He set an indigo-colored little package to one side. When he looked up and accidentally met her gaze, he immediately looked away. Chu Lian noticed that his expression seemed a little weird, and the tips of his ears were slightly red. Her brows drew together in confusion, and she looked downwards at herself. It was then that all was made clear, and her own face started flushing red. The inner clothes she had been wearing had loosened in her sleep. Since the tie holding the two sides of her top closed had been broken by someone, her clothes were wide open, showing the light yellow halter top she wore inside. However, the halter top had also shifted in her sleep and was now exposing a great amount of her fair skin. There were obvious red marks all over the skin on her chest, the remaining evidence of He-Sanlang's indulgence last night. Chu Lian glared at him and quickly pulled her top closed. She barked at him angrily. "Turn around." This time, He-Sanlang was strangely obedient. He turned around without any retort. Once Chu Lian was sure that he couldn't see her, she quickly adjusted her own clothes. However, when she found out that the tie keeping her top closed had been broken, she could no longer suppress her upset emotions. Changdi, this is all your fault." He-Sanlang had already forgotten about that small detail. When his wife started shouting at him out of the blue, he felt rather aggrieved. He pressed his lips together, but he still kept his back to her like she had ordered. "Can I turn back now? Turn back here." Chu Lian fumed. When Changdi turned around and looked at Chu Lian, he finally understood what she was angry about. A furious blush flared to life on his cheeks as he recalled how exactly he had broken that cloth tie last night. His right hand twitched in remembrance as well. Even the cool He-Sanlang couldn't quite summon up the courage to speak in the face of his wife's admonishment at this point. "Do you have any clothes? Get me some." She could only make do by holding her inner clothes closed for now. The fox fur cloak she had been wearing yesterday was now completely covered in horse blood and was stinking to high heaven. She couldn't put that on her anymore. Changdi coughed awkwardly and reached out towards a small cabinet built into the wall of the warm pen. He dug around in it and found a set of clothes. "We don't have any female clothing here. You have to make do with mine first." This was the snowboat that Changdi had taken to Sioux City, so there were a few sets of his clothes in here. Since they were still stuck in the vast snowy plains, Chu Lian had no choice but to wear He-Sanlang's clothes for now. He had given her a thick, black, long robe with green bamboo patterns embroidered on it. It seemed like any other piece of clothing at first, but once she pulled it on, she immediately felt the difference between her and Sanlang. He-Sanlang's figure was tall and lanky. After training for almost half a year in the north, his body had become much more sturdy as compared to before. Conversely, Chu Lian's figure was small and slim. When the two of them stood together, she only reached his chest. Now that she had He-Sanlang's robe on her, she looked as if she was wearing some long-sleeved stage costume. After she finished doing up the round little buttons on the top, the robe still felt loose around her. Chu Lian sighed. She really didn't have any other options. She couldn't just keep wearing a single layer of inner clothing with the tie broken. Even if she didn't have to meet anyone in that state, she would surely freeze to death. She climbed up from her nest of blankets and dug out her waistband before using it to tie up the huge robe around her. Following that, she rolled up the sleeves high so she could finally see her hands. Once she was done with all that, Chu Lian heaved a sigh of relief. Now she could sit down in peace. He Sanlang was watching her with his slightly slanted eyes the whole time. Actually, the robe was made to be worn by itself, and he usually didn't need a waistband to tie it up. However, in order to hold the loose robe down, Chu Lian had to use the waistband from her inner clothes to tie it down. Unexpectedly, once the robe was secured, it only emphasized the curves on Chu Lian's chest. His mind drifted back to the sensation on his hands last night without his bidding. Furthermore, Chu Lian was wearing his clothes right now. Any man would feel a sense of domination and satisfaction upon seeing the woman he liked in his clothes. Chu Lian didn't know that her simple actions had somehow managed to satisfy a hidden desire of Sanlang's. She sat down and turned her gaze to the package that Sanlang had brought with him. She gulped once. Her stomach started rumbling loudly just in time. Sanlang was pulled back to the present by the sound. However, he didn't seem disagreeable at all. Instead, he seemed to understand what she wanted. He passed over the cloth bag in his hands to Chu Lian. Eat something first to fill your belly. We'll reach the main camp by evening. Chapter 409. Take good care of your wife, too. When she opened up the bag, there was just some jerky and preserved food. Chu Lian didn't mind the poor offerings and simply started eating. In a situation like this, Chu Lian knew better than to complain about the food. No matter what, she couldn't let herself go hungry. Sanlang sat at one corner and watched her eat. When he didn't catch any trace of disdain or unhappiness in her expression, a part of his heart relaxed and warmed up at the same time. Actually, Chu Lian was a very caring and considerate lady. She had never been difficult on purpose, and everyone got along well with her, no matter their position. She wasn't at all like the spoiled and aloof noble ladies of the capital. When he thought back to the reports he had received from Prince Jean regarding Chu Lian, his brows suddenly drew together and his chest tightened. Although Chu Lian was the sixth miss of the Ying estate, her mother had died when she was young and Chu Qijing had remarried. As the saying went, once there was a stepmother, there would be a stepfather. She hadn't been favored in her estate. Since there were too many children in the Ying estate, Duke Ying and Duchess Ying had never taken notice of her. She hadn't had a good life in the Ying estate. Her quality of living was sometimes even worse than some of the concubine-born daughters in the estate. He had never given much thought to Chu Lian's past before. However, when he thought of it now, his heart felt a little heavy. Chu Lian was currently focused on the jerky, so she hadn't noticed any of Sanlang's little changes in mood. Even if she knew what he was thinking now, she would only roll her eyes at him. Anyway, the person he was lamenting for wasn't her. She wasn't the original Chu Lian. She couldn't even recognize all the people in the Ying estate. However, Sanlang had gotten something right. Although Chu Lian was picky with her food and loved eating good food, she wasn't someone who would be difficult on purpose. She would consider the circumstances she was in before thinking of making good food. If she still fussed about food while in dire situations, wasn't that the quickest way to die? Once her stomach was full, Chu Lian sat by the brazier in the warm pen and kept herself warm. The glowing embers cast a red glow over Chu Lian's fair face. It was rare for the couple to get a chance to sit together for a chat like this. Actually, when Sanlang wasn't in one of his fits of lunacy, he was still a pretty handsome man, albeit rather stone-faced. Chu Lian couldn't get enough of his looks. Under Chu Lian's forceful questioning, Changdi reported every detail of how he had come to find her. However, he hid the details about the murders of the 4 kidnappers. Changdi didn't know why he had done so subconsciously. When he looked into Chu Lian's wide and trusting eyes, he just felt the urge to protect the innocence shining within them. Chu Lian stared into the embers in the brazier, her eyes sparkling. Her head was lowered, so no one could see the upwards curve of her lips she hadn't been able to hold back. She hadn't made the wrong choice to stay with this husband of hers now, hadn't she? When evening came, before the last traces of the sun fell below the horizon, He Changdi and the rest of the search party managed to reach the border camp on time. Captain Guo, Sima Hui, Zhang Mai, Tang Yin, and the others had already gotten the news and were waiting at the main camp entrance to welcome them back. Chu Lian was still wearing He Changdi's clothes, so it wasn't appropriate for her to make an appearance. He Changdi jumped out of the warm pen with his usual cold expression and exchanged a few words with the welcome party before personally escorting Chu Lian to her tent. Once Chu Lian had changed into a proper set of clothes and become presentable again, she came out to personally greet all of the friends who had been worried for her. Since Chu Lian was still living in the female camp, it wasn't good for He Changdi to stay there, so he returned to his own camp and tent after giving Wenqing and Wanlan some instructions. Once he entered his tent, he could hear Xiao Hongyu and the others talking. Captain Guo and Zhang Mai hurried over after seeing He Sanlang enter the tent. Captain Guo patted his shoulders. It's good that sister-in-law is safe. Don't think too much about all of this. Zhang Mai chipped in with his own words of comfort. The two of them were much older than He Changdi and Xiao Hongyu, so they thought more than the others. Chu Lian was a woman after all. After getting kidnapped like that, even if she had her identity as an honored lady to keep some from talking, there was plenty that other people could say about a woman taken out to the wilds by a pack of rogues. If rumors like those affected her reputation, it wouldn't be good for the young couple. Captain Guo was afraid that He Sanlang would overthink things. He Sanlang was a little dumbfounded, which showed in his expression as he looked at his two older brothers. He replied helplessly, "What are you thinking about? Why would I even think like that?" When Captain Guo heard his response and saw that he seemed open-minded, he finally set down his worries. "You brat. I'm not worrying for you. All right, it's good as long as you understand. Sister-in-law is a good lady. You had better not mistreat her. During these years of peace, what kind of noble lady would come all the way out here to this desolate north and suffer through so much for the sake of her husband?" Although honored Lady Jinyi's words and actions showed maturity beyond her years, she was still a young lady who hadn't even reached the age of 16. "Thank you for your concern, brothers, but you've worried too much for this matter. Rest assured, I've already ordered my men to seal their lips shut. Not many people know about what happened other than my trusted subordinates." He Changdi was usually meticulous with his actions. Before leaving the main camp to look for Chu Lian, he had already settled the matters at hand in the army. Since he had the responsibility of being Chu Lian's husband, he couldn't allow her reputation to be besmirched. Captain Guo nodded in admiration. He was also someone who would protect his wife with his life, so he understood why He Sanlang had done so. "Relax, they'll take care of everything else in the army. I won't let anyone spread the news." When He Sanlang heard this, he made the rare gesture of bowing deeply to Captain Guo. The corners of Zhang Mei's lips lifted up. "What are you being so formal for between us brothers?" Captain Guo burst out into laughter. "Let him bow. We deserve this gesture. Damn brat, take good care of your wife from now on." Chapter 410. Protecting his wife, 1. Although it was a very common phrase, it sounded a little strange to He Changdi when it finally filtered into his mind. He felt like there was a double meaning to the word care, especially after he had experienced more intimate contact with his wife. Thus, the tips of He Sanlang's ears started turning a little red. Captain Guo and the others didn't notice this little detail. At most, they just thought that He Sanlang's expression seemed slightly awkward. However, they weren't bothered about such minute changes amongst brothers. The men sat down at the center of the tent. As He Changdi removed his sword from his waist, Zhang Mai glanced at him and asked, "Have you found the culprit behind this?" He Sanlang looked at his brothers and said a single name, Xiao Bojian. Although his tone hadn't changed, Captain Guo was able to sense the deep hatred for the man in his heart. Zhang Mai furrowed his brows. His surprise showed in his voice as he asked, "I've never heard of this name before. How is he involved in this?" Captain Guo's home was in the capital and he exchanged letters with his wife and children regularly, so he knew a little more about the news in the capital compared to Zhang Mai. He frowned as well. That person is this year's top scholar for the imperial examinations. His good name has spread through the whole city. He's old Duke Ying's disciple. When the mention of Duke Ying came up, Captain Guo shot a meaningful look at He Changdi as his expression turned a little strange. Xiao Hongyu was lying on his bed. His lips tilted to one side. That old man Duking must be really blind. He's raised a feral wolf by his side without knowing. The young Xiao Hongyu had somehow stumbled upon the truth of it. He Sanling sat down and poured himself a cup of tea. After holding up the cup and taking a small sip, his brows drew together and set down the cup. It was clear he didn't like the mixed taste of sencha. He licked his lips and realized that Chu Lian's sickly sweet honey water was actually better than sencha. Although housing is linked to me in marriage, we're not close to housing. Sanling had put it nicely. Not only were they not close to housing, Chu Lian probably would never want to go back. Changdi brought his fingers together and touched the green Hutian jade ring on his right thumb before continuing. Xiao Bojian is currently the secretary of the Northwestern Army encamped in Sioux City. This time, Captain Gua and Zhang Mei's expressions both changed. Surprise and bewilderment showed on their faces. They had never expected a newly minted top scholar to have climbed his way up the ranks in court so quickly. When Captain Gua noticed the darkness swirling in Changdi's eyes, he startled a little and held down Sanlang's shoulder. We have to think about this in the long term. Don't be rash. Sanling looked helplessly at his two older brothers. Brother Gua, Brother Zhang, don't worry about me. I'm not an impulsive person. In his past life, he had already suffered enough torture under the hands of that adulterous couple. How would he fall for their tricks once again? Once bitten, twice shy. But he had already been bitten more than just once. Although Changdi was young, even great General Qian placed utmost trust in him, let alone his band of brothers. Zhang Mai patted Changdi's shoulder in comfort. However, he added on, there's one more thing. Sanling looked up at Zhang Mai in slight confusion. You probably don't know this yet since you just came back to camp, but the traitor in our camp has been caught. It was Gao Jiangwei. Zhang Mei's expression was grave, as were his words. Although Gao Jiangwei didn't get along with their right-wing army and constantly went against them in the northern border troops, conflict within an army was one thing and selling out their country was another. Even if they fought within the army ranks, there wouldn't be any grudges left once one side won. However, if they betrayed the entire army by colluding with the enemy, the entire army would look down on them. Who could have expected Gao Jiangwei to have done such a thing? Great General Qian was also both shocked and angry. He immediately decided to have Gao Jiangwei executed under the flagpoles of the border camp. Changdi was a little startled. He remembered that Gao Jiangwei's collusion with the enemy hadn't been discovered in his past life. Not only that, he had even earned a lot of merit from this war, and had later been personally titled General Chongping by the Emperor himself. He had also been awarded a noble rank along with the title. Thoughts swirled in Sanlang's eyes. Although Gao Jiangwei was narrow-minded, he didn't have much courage to do anything. If he had really sent secret military information to the two Huns, then there had to be a mastermind behind it. The execution will be held tomorrow. In order to send a warning to the whole army, the general will be doing the execution himself in front of the two wings and the female army. We have to be present as well. On this night, everyone was able to set aside the worries in their hearts to have a good night's rest. Even the burdened Sanlang was no exception. Since the Tuhan army had already been defeated, it wasn't too appropriate for Chu Lian to continue staying in the camp. The next morning, Changdi escorted her back to Liangzhou City's He estate, along with his subordinates and House Jinggan's private soldiers. Changdi didn't sit in the warm pen together with Chu Lian this time, and stayed on horseback next to the snowboat instead. Imo Chungue was following right behind him, his old face wrinkled up. He stared at Changdi for a long time with his lips parted and a conflicted expression. In the end, he wasn't able to say a single word. Changdi cast a neutral glance at him before speaking. Uncle Imo, if you think that you shouldn't speak up, then don't speak at all. Keep your words to yourself forever. Imo Chungue was startled by the frank words and hurriedly chased up to Changdi on his horse. He looked around them first before asking Sanlang in a low tone, "Third young master, when third young madam was taken away?" Chapter 411. Protecting his wife, too. Before he could finish speaking, he was interrupted by Changdi. He stared at Imo Chungue unhappily with a threatening aura that demanded obedience. "Uncle Imo, you had better remember this. Nothing happened to Lianer at all. If I happen to hear anything that says otherwise, I won't let you off easy even if you've served our family for so long. Imo Chungue was shocked by the sudden forceful air his third young master had taken. That aura had been exactly like that of the old count when he had still been alive. Like a bucket of cold water, it had completely woken him up. In the end, Imo Chungue glanced at Sanlang and chose to seal his lips on this matter. Please rest assured, third young master. This old Imo knows how to behave. It's good that Uncle Imo knows how to behave. I hope that Uncle Imo will pass down this order to the rest of the old soldiers. I don't want to hear any other misunderstandings about Lianer in the future either. After throwing down those words, Changdi twitched the reins in his hands and pushed his horse ahead to the warm pen where Chu Lien was. Imo Chungue stopped his mount and stared at Changdis leaving back as he moved to meet his wife. Uncertainty wavered in his heart. Ever since he had come to the northern border and seen everything that Changdi had done in the military for himself, his turbid old eyes had a new shine to them. The current Count Jingon, also known as the North Defender General of the border at Mingzhou, was a large, tan and burly man who simply didn't look at all like the tall and slim old Count Jingon. If not for how loving the old Count and Countess had been, and how he had watched matriarchy swelling up for 10 months and eventually giving birth to Count Jingon, he would even have suspected that the current Count Jingon wasn't the old Count's biological son. Everyone said that Sanlang took after his mother, Countess Jingon, but that was because they had never seen old Count Jingon in person. Out of the 3 sons that Madame Lu had given birth to, Sanlang was the most similar to the old Count when he had been young. This was most evident in his slender build and his steady and introverted nature. It was most likely because of the similarity to her husband that the matriarch liked this grandson of hers the most. The second son of House Jingon was already 24 this year. Even though he still refused to take a wife, the matriarch had left him to his own devices. However, when Sanlang came of age, the matriarch had gone to plead the Empress Dowager for the sake of getting him one of House Ying's fertile young misses. This wasn't purely because matriarchy wanted the He bloodline to go on, but also because she wanted the grandson who looked the most like her husband to leave behind some children of his blood for the future. A resolute glint lit up in Imo Chungue's old eyes. He seemed to have returned to the days when he had followed the old Count to the battlefields and lost themselves in the heat of battle. Since the old Count had already gone ahead without him, he would have to take the place of the old Count to take care of the grandson who looked the most like him. When they returned to the He estate, Sanlang actually personally helped Chu Lien out of the warm pen. Wenqing and Wanlan were waiting on Chu Lien nearby. When they saw this, they couldn't contain the elation on their faces. It seemed like this incident hadn't created a gap between third young master and third young madam, but had actually pulled the young couple closer instead. Chu Lien shot a look at the huge palm that Sanlang had offered to her and placed her tiny hand in. The corners of her lips curled up. Just as the couple had entered the He estate and settled down at the table, before they even had the time to breathe, Imo Chungue had already strode in with someone behind him. It was a familiar face to all of them. Liyue? This was when Chu Lien recalled that Changdi had entrusted the matter of searching for the Snow Mountain Mist Flower to Liyue. Did this mean that there was good news? As the thought crossed her mind, she became even more alert. When Liyue entered the hall after Imo Chungue, his face was practically radiating joy. Even before Changdi or Chu Lien could ask, he had already spoken up, unable to contain himself. Third young master, third young madam, we found it. We found the Snow Mountain mists. As expected, Chu Lien's almond-shaped eyes lit up. Did you find it at Mount Uming? Have you heard when it will bloom? Liyue nodded so furiously that he looked like a chicken pecking at grain. We've investigated all the details. It seems like the Snow Mountain mist will bloom in about 7 or 8 days. We heard from an old barbarian living at the foot of Mount Uming that the flower blooms for about 5 days. We just have to climb up to the mountain peak during this period and pluck the flower. Although there wasn't any change in Changdi's expression, his eyes were also overflowing with the light of expectation. Since that's so, send out the orders. Prepare to leave immediately. Well, depart for the mountain tomorrow. Imo Chungue had received the good news along with them, so he followed Liyue and went off to prepare for the journey. Soon, only the young couple were left in the hall. along with Wenqing and Wanlan. Chu Lian abruptly turned to He Changdi with her eyes sparkling. She was about to speak when He Changdi cut in first. "You're not allowed to go." Chu Lian was stunned speechless, but she had enough wit left to roll her eyes. What was this? When had He Sanlang learned how to read her mind? She hadn't even said anything yet, but he had already anticipated what she was going to say. He Changdi's gaze fell onto her ankle. "The wound on my ankle healed a long time ago. I can walk the same as any other person now." He Sanlang remained resolute. "Even so, you're not allowed to go. Be good and stay in the He estate. I'll lead my men to Mount Aming." In the end, no matter how Chu Lian tried to persuade him, He Sanlang was stubborn and refused to let her go. Even though Chu Lian was on the verge of getting angry at him, He Sanlang still remained steadfast. Chu Lian had no choice but to give up on following along. Actually, she knew that He Sanlang was worried for her health. However, when she saw him being so stubborn, she just wanted to knock heads with him anyway. Chapter 412. Looking for Snow Mountain Mists. 1. Of course, she obviously wasn't allowed to go in the end, so she stayed in the mansion. However, she wasn't silly enough to just wait around doing nothing. She compiled modern tips and tricks for hiking onto a sheet of paper for He Changdi to take along with him. Although Chu Lian had never climbed Mount Everest in her past life, she had tried climbing some other snow mountains. Furthermore, she had taken the time to go through several lessons with professional coaches, so it was obvious that she was more well-trained for mountain climbing than the people of ancient times. When He Sanlang tucked the things to note list away into his clothes to keep it, it felt as if his heart was being warmed by the thin piece of paper. When he looked at the writing on the paper and saw how different it was to her writing in his past life, He Changdi didn't know why he didn't feel a single shred of alarm or oddity. Conversely, the tightly wound nerves in his heart had relaxed. The northern border troops had achieved an overwhelming victory over the 100,000-strong Tuan army, and this news only took 2 days to reach Suzhou City, next to Lake Qianshan. Suzhou City then passed on the news to the capital, sent out at the highest speed and priority. The Scourge of the North had been defeated, and it was coming close to the new year. If the good news could reach the capital before New Year's Eve, then the celebrations in the capital would be even more joyous. With their borders safe and their tributary states coming down to pay their respects for the new year, it was a double blessing for the Great Wu dynasty. When the news reached Suzhou City, Xiao Bojian was in the middle of drinking some tea in his tent. 3 men dressed in black were kneeling in the center. One stood right next to Xiao Bojian at his usual place. He was trying his best to erase all signs of his presence, afraid that he might provoke his unstable master somehow. Xiao Bojian's cool gaze swept over the 3 kneeling men at one glance. Although his tone seemed normal, the 3 men knew exactly what he meant when he spoke. They couldn't help but shiver in fear. 1. Settle this according to our standard procedures. Even the leader of the secret guards, 1, couldn't hold back a shiver from the unfeeling words. However, he didn't have any right to plead for mercy for them. He walked up to the 3 men and stuffed a small brown pill in each person's mouth so quickly that they couldn't react. After having the small pill forcefully fed down their throats, the faces of the 3 men turned deathly pale. It's your last chance now. You know what will happen if this poison isn't cured after a month. One gave the 3 men their warning. Following that, Xiao Bojian dismissed them with a wave of his hand. One took his place at Xiao Bojian's side again, turning back into an invisible person. Only he knew what he felt inside at this moment. He just couldn't understand how a pampered and weak girl like Honored Lady Jeannie could have escaped from the hands of their deadly operatives. She had also been able to kill the 4 operatives before escaping. His throat suddenly felt a little dry, and cold sweat gathered on his back. Xiao Bojian's features had always been more feminine. The threatening aura draped around him only emphasized the sinister cast of his face. Now that the northern border troops had won the Northern War, there was no longer any need for the Northwestern Army to continue camping at Suzhou City. He believed the Emperor would recall the Northwestern Army once he received the news and send them back to their original posts. Then he would be returning back to the capital soon. Although he refused to accept this truth, there was no longer any need to remain in Suzhou. But thinking of Liana, Whenever Xiao Bojian thought of how Chu Lian was still by He Changde's side, his rage would slip out of his control and he would feel the urge to rip He Changde to shreds. While the clouds hanging over Xiao Bojian's expression had yet to fade, someone outside the tent had something to report. Returning to his senses, Xiao Bojian hid his emotions and allowed the messenger to enter. The entrance flap was lifted and a low-ranking soldier entered with a letter. The soldier greeted with utmost respect, "Sir Xiao, you have a letter from the capital." It was one who stepped forward and picked up the letter, handing the letter to Xiao Bojian with 2 hands. Xiao Bojian gripped the thin letter with his slender fingers and waved in dismissal at the soldier. The soldier then bowed his head and left. As he stared at the letter, his brows drew together. He checked both sides of the envelope, but there weren't any markings on the letter at all. If not for the feeling of something inside the envelope, he would have thought that it was empty. He sneered inside. This was probably a ploy from someone. His parents had died when he was young, and his clan had fallen into decline. There weren't that many of them left. The only people he was familiar with in the capital were members of House Ying and his schoolmates. He had already received House Ying's letter a few days ago, so this couldn't have been sent by old Duke Ying. This made the anonymous sender even more of a mystery. After tearing the envelope open, he took out a thin piece of paper. Not much was written within. Only up to half the paper had been filled. However, just the content alone was enough to make Xiao Bojian's expression change completely. The disdain that had been on his face was instantly wiped clean. He suddenly gripped the paper in his hands hard as his features contorted. After a moment, he actually burst out into loud laughter. The sight was so spine-chilling and fearsome that even one's body trembled. Master, is something wrong? The heavens are truly on my side." Xiao Bojian was already so immersed in the waves of excitement overwhelming him that he didn't even hear what one said. His upturned eyes were filled with excitement as he gripped the letter in his hand. "Send some men to Mount Aming. They must annihilate He Changde no matter the cost. If they fail the mission, then their heads will roll. Send someone to investigate the source of this letter as well." One didn't dare to question his master further and immediately left to carry out his commands. Chapter 413. Looking for Snow Mountain Mists 2. After one left, Xiao Bojian was left alone in the tent. He stared at the words on the letter. "Mount Aming, Snow Mountain Mists." He's Sanlang. "This is going to be a journey of no return for you." After staring at the letter for a while, Xiao Bojian felt that the writing was strangely familiar, but he lost the feeling after inspecting it carefully. When he gave it some thought, Xiao Bojian couldn't help but find it strange. He Changde had gone into the army so quickly. Just who could it be that hated him so much? House Jinggan didn't have many enemies in the capital as Count Jinggan spent most of his time guarding Mingzhou. Furthermore, the information contained in the letter was a huge secret that should only be known to the family members of House Jinggan. Even his spies hadn't been able to find out that they needed the Snow Mountain Mistflower. Xiao Bojian's eyes turned into narrow slits as he pondered. The following day, He Changde brought a team of people he trusted and rushed towards Mount Aming. Mount Aming wasn't too far from Liangzhou City. Now that they had the snowboats and the warm pins, there wasn't any place that was out of reach for them even on the snowy days of the northern border. The northern border troops had just achieved a huge victory, and He Sanlang was one of the soldiers who had contributed much to that. After he had privately explained his reasons to Great General Qin, the general had kindly given him half a month off, and even allowed him to choose a few elite soldiers to accompany him. He Changde didn't depart from the He estate, and left directly from the main camp instead. Thus, Chu Lian didn't have to send him off. On the third day after He Sanlang had left for Mount Aming, Chu Lian had just gotten up from bed when she noticed Manager Qin, Wenqing and Wanlan all busy directing the other servants in a buzz of activity. Her courtyard was especially lively with people going to and fro. Even Yurihan and her 2 children were pitching in to help. Chu Lian was flabbergasted. She didn't know what they were so busy with. When Wanlan noticed her bewildered young madam standing in the corridor and watching them, she hurriedly went over to welcome her with a smile. "Third young madam, why didn't you put on an extra cloak on such a cold day?" Chu Lian waved her hand to indicate that she was fine. Her body was completely healthy now, and she wasn't that fragile. What are you so busy with? There are so many people moving about so early in the morning. Winland's eyes widened with how startled she was. She covered the smile that had sprung up on her lips. Third young madam, you must have forgotten the date. The Kitchen God Festival is approaching, so we are getting everyone to clean the courtyard in preparation for the Kitchen God Festival. Chu Lian smacked her head. Her mind had been so occupied with worries these few days that she had completely forgotten about the Kitchen God Festival. It was December 18th now, so in a few more days, it would be the Kitchen God Festival. She smiled helplessly. That's right. I've actually forgotten such an important date. Wanlan smiled along with her and ordered one of the maidservants passing by to retrieve a list, which she then passed to Chu Lian. Third young madam, these are the things that Manager Qin, Winching and I have come up with after discussing what we need to prepare. Please take a look and let Manager Qin know if there's anything we've missed out. Chu Lian took the list from her and glanced over the long list of goods. She felt a little overwhelmed. They had even listed all the types of dried fruits and nuts they needed. Her fingers pointed at a few items on the list. This, and this. Are we able to get these in Liangzhou City? Wanlan covered her mouth and chuckled. Third young madam, have you forgotten that we have the snowboat now? Suzhou City isn't far from Liangzhou. If we rush over there to buy the things we need now, we'll definitely be able to send them back before the Kitchen God Festival. Chu Lian, all right, she had actually forgotten about the sled she had ordered to be made. After hearing what Wanlan had said, a light bulb lit up in Chu Lian's head. Her limpid eyes were sparkling brightly as if there were gold ingots in her eyes. Quick, go and call Manager Qin over. Before Wanlan could answer her, she turned back and returned to her room. She sat by the desk in front of the window and began fervently writing with her charcoal pen. When Wanlan led Manager Qin in, Chu Lian was still hunched over the table. Seeing that she was in deep concentration, Wanlan didn't dare to disturb her, so she stood there silently waiting, along with Manager Qin. By the time Chu Lian had finished writing out the idea that had suddenly struck her, an hour had already passed. She stretched out her sore body. It was only when she turned her head that she noticed the two waiting for her. Chu Lian walked over to the warm hearth and pointed at the seats on either side of her. Everyone, take a seat. I have some orders for you. Following that, Chu Lian handed over the papers in her hand to Manager Qin on her right. It wasn't the first time Manager Qin had worked for Chu Lian. No one knew better than he did how novel Chu Lian's ideas and how well she could execute them. He respectfully received the few pieces of paper, and his attention was immediately taken away by them. He lowered his head and started reading earnestly. At first, the space between his brows was wrinkled in confusion, but as he got to the end, his eyes started sparkling even more. Finally, his whole face was flushed red from his excitement. He held the few pieces of paper reverently as if they were some ancient treasure. Manager Qin looked at Chu Lian with his eyes as wide as they could go. Third young madam, please entrust this matter to this humble one. This humble one will definitely execute everything perfectly. Chu Lian smiled. I called you over to look at this, so of course I was planning to hand this task over to you. Even if you want to reject this task, I won't allow you to. After getting confirmation from Chu Lian, Manager Qin's excitement shot through the roof. Thank you for granting my wish, third young madam. This humble one will head out to select the helpers immediately. Wanlan stared after Manager Qin with a face full of curiosity. When she saw how stirred up he was as he ran out, her face showed that she couldn't make heads or tails of it. Third young madam, what's wrong with Manager Qin? Why is he acting like that all of a sudden? Chu Lian smiled secretively, but didn't explain her plan to Wanlan at all. TL note: the Kitchen God Festival, also known as the Little New Year, is typically held on the 23rd or 24th day of the 12th month of the lunar calendar. Basically, 5 to 6 days before New Year's Eve. This day is taken as the start of the New Year festivities. The Kitchen God, Zhao Jun, records every good and bad thing that every household has done over the past year. Sort of like a Chinese Santa Claus, the day of the Kitchen God Festival is when he takes a break and brings his reports to the Jade Emperor. On this day, Chinese households make offerings to him in order to get better reports or keep their bad deeds from being known. There's a Wikipedia article on him if you want to know more. https:// Wikipedia. org/wiki/kitten hashtag. Check out his origin story too. I found it pretty interesting. Chapter 414. Ant. 1. Instead, Chu Lian changed the topic. Since the border troops have come out victorious, we should celebrate the new year even more. I've thought of some foods we can have for the new year. Go and discuss it with Wenqing, then put all the ingredients we need on this list and hand it over to Manager Qin. After all that had happened ever since they had come to Liangzhou, Wanlan was very happy to see that her mistress had finally recovered the mood to cook up some good food. Chu Lian had just mentioned the food offhandedly, and Wanlan was already bubbling with questions about what she was going to make this time. Although they were stuck out here in rural Liangzhou, Chu Lian didn't want to just make do for this new year. Anyway, they weren't going to make it back to the capital in time for New Year's Day. So why not make their own preparations here and have some nice festivities with Yichangdi? Thus, for the following days, Chu Lian, Wenqing and Wanlan made spring rolls, dumpling skins, then the actual dumplings, New Year cake, and all sorts of assorted snacks. Time passed so quickly that it was already the night of the Kitchen God Festival in the blink of an eye. Chu Lian and the maidservants prayed to the Kitchen God before they sat down with Yuri Han and her sons for a hearty dinner. Wenqing and Wanlan weren't willing to sit at the same table as their mistress at first, but after Chu Lian shot them a warning look, the two of them sat down awkwardly. The table was filled with all sorts of food. A huge hot pot was placed right in the center with plenty of ingredients prepared next to it. There were thin slices of beef and mutton, tofu, clean sheep intestines, dried vegetables, bean curd skin, beef meatballs. Chu Lian and a whole group of maidservants had been kept busy the whole day in order to prepare this authentic Chongqing hot pot. Other than the lack of fresh vegetables, it was pretty much the same as the modern Chongqing hot pot. There was some weak yellow rice wine, especially suited for women to drink, warming over the brazier. Chu Lian waved her hand to signal the maidservants to start cooking. The He estate in Liangzhou was filled with people making merry and enjoying the passing of the Kitchen God Festival. Even the outer court was no exception, with Li Xing and the old soldiers leading the celebrations. However, it wasn't so peaceful and lively back in the Jinggan estate in the capital. At the end of November, the estate had been greeted with the news that heir Jinggan's servant concubine, Miaozhen, was pregnant. On the very same day, the heir's wife, Madame Zhou, had burst out in a fit of temper and broken the teacup in her hand. She had even brought senior servant Xiao and her handmaid, Jin Shui, to Miaozhen's courtyard to make a fuss. Miaozhen had almost been force-fed some herbal medicine to make her miscarry. Luckily, her maidservant had been quick-witted enough to run away and report the situation to Countess Jinggan, Madame Lu. When Madame Lu had heard what was going on, she flipped her lid and pushed her sickly body out of bed to stop Madame Zhou. Following that, she had brought Miaozhen back to her side so that she could have a peaceful pregnancy. However, after forcing herself out of bed and having her blood pressure shoot up from her anger, the efforts that great Dr. Miao had put into strengthening her body were completely wasted. The state of her health was back to where they had started. When He Changqi returned to the estate, since she had no other outlet to vent her anger on, Madame Zhou had another huge quarrel with him. He Dalong had been feeling guilty about the whole mess at first, but after what Madame Zhou put him through, the little bit of guilt he had been harboring instantly disappeared. Madame Zhou took her two daughters with her back to her maiden home, the Dingyuan estate, for a week. After getting persuaded by her mother, and after matriarch, he sent a messenger over to invite her back. She finally returned to the Jinggan estate. The new year was almost here. The estate couldn't do without a woman in charge of the household, and there was no one else who could take the post. However, Madame Zhou suddenly started playing up her helplessness at this time. Her belly was still boiling with anger. Furthermore, the stores in House Jinggan's name weren't earning much. They had to spend lots of money to keep up their dignity as a noble house while visiting friends around in the capital. On this day, she brought her two daughters over to Qingxi Hall to give their greetings to the matriarch. Madame Zhou pulled the 6-year-old little N and the 4-year-old little Lin close to her and whispered in their ears, "Hurry up and greet your great-grandmother." Little N and little Lin ran over to the matriarch on their little legs and called out sweetly in unison, "Great-grandmother." The matriarch patted the two girls' heads with affection. When she had a good look at how the two girls were dressed, Matriarchy's expression abruptly turned grave. It's almost the new year now. Why haven't you let the children dress up a little? At such a young age, they should be wearing brighter and livelier colors. They should have their golden lock amulets and pearls too. After Matriarch mentioned their dressing, everyone in the parlor directed their gazes on the two youngest misses of the house. They showed all sorts of expressions after doing so. The two young girls were wearing some worn and plain-colored short dresses today. There wasn't even a single kind of decoration on their little heads. Even the pearl-inlaid gold collars they usually wore had been taken off. They didn't look anything like the precious noble ladies they were. Instead, they looked no different from the daughters of commoners. It was going to be the new year in a few more days, yet the legitimate misses of their estate were dressed so shabbily and poor. No wonder the matriarch wasn't pleased. Madame Zoe had been waiting for Matriarch to say something like this. She gripped the handkerchief in her hand without saying a word, as if she was embarrassed to speak. Senior servant Xiao couldn't stand seeing her mistress like that, so she spoke up. Matriarch, please pardon us. The two young misses are our madam's dear children. How could eldest young madam bear to treat them shabbily? It's just that our eldest young madam has found it hard to make ends meet as the lady in charge, especially since we're preparing for the new year now. Eldest young madam still has to spend an appropriate amount for gifts to other estates so that our estate won't be looked down upon. Since the two misses are eldest young madam's daughters, the two misses have to share a little of the burden now that the main branch has cut down on spending. Senior servant Xiao immediately kneeled down right after she finished speaking, as if she knew she had done wrong by explaining all that and was prepared to receive any punishment for speaking out of turn. This made it hard for the matriarch to say anything else. TL no, how can we celebrate the Kitchen God Festival without some food porn? Chongqing hot pot is famous for being really spicy. I found an article talking about how Chongqing hot pot started if you want to know more. And of course, some pictures to help illustrate the tasty food, Chongqing hot pot, a nice spread of hot pot dishes. Chapter 4:15. Aunt 2. The corners of Madame Zoe's eyes reddened and she mumbled, Grandmother, it's granddaughter-in-law, who wasn't capable enough to manage the household properly and made grandmother worry. Matriarch frowned deeply. Although she was starting to dislike this granddaughter-in-law of hers more and more, Dalong had indeed taken a concubine before he had turned 30, so she still felt like she owed Madame Zoe a little for that. After thinking for a bit, the matriarch swallowed her frustrations. Bring over the public account books for me to see how much we're lacking. Madame Zoe celebrated inwardly even while she had her head lowered in an obedient pose. She quickly shot her handmaid Jin Shui a look. In a short moment, the account books had been brought over. Matriarch set the account books on a table next to her and waved her hand at Madame Zoe. Go and mind your tasks. I'll keep this account book with me for now. Come back again tomorrow morning. Also, little N and little Lin are still young. Even if we can't make ends meet any longer, we can't let the children suffer. Madame Zoe stood up and led her two daughters to bow towards the matriarch with reverence. Thank you for your teachings, grandmother. Granddaughter-in-law won't let this happen again. All right, you're dismissed. Madame Zoe left and brought her daughters back to the main branch's courtyard. Little N and little Lin were taken back to their own rooms by their nursemaids. Only Madame Zoe's most trusted servants, Senior Servant Xiao and the handmaid Jin Shui, were left in the room. Senior Servant Xiao passed a teacup to Madame Zoe. Eldest young madam, will this really work? Even though third young madam is no longer in the estate, the matriarch servants are still managing Gillen Restaurant. The matriarch didn't agree to this before, so why would the matriarch agree to it now? Madame Zoe harumphed. This time, it's not up to the matriarch any longer. Just wait and see. Although Senior Servant Xiao didn't agree with what Madame Zoe was doing, she couldn't stop her anymore. When she heard so, she could only sigh inwardly. Ever since the heir had taken a concubine, Madame Zoe's thoughts had gone to new extremes. Actually, House Jinggan's family tradition was one of the best around. Even though Changqi hadn't waited until he was 30 to take a concubine, according to the family laws, he was already 29 this year. That was already close enough to 30. The couple had been married for almost 10 years, but they still only had little N and little Lin. There was no male heir for House Jingon at the moment. It was perfectly normal for the senior family members in any other noble house to be feeling antsy by now. Even so, eldest young madam wasn't putting her efforts into winning back her husband, but on trying to control the family fortunes instead. Senior servant Xiao lamented again in her heart. Madame Zhou's eyes were still alight with her determination. The matriarch's only daughter was about to return home. She really had to thank the person who had revealed that information to her. Within Qingxi Hall, matriarchy was still lying back on the wooden couch with an account book in hand. The more she looked at the accounts, the more she wanted to tear the book apart with her bare hands. Senior servant Lu was doing some embroidery next to the old matriarch, together with Mu Xiang. When she saw the tightly furrowed brows and depressed expression on the matriarch, she quickly set down the needle and thread in her hands to walk over to the matriarch's side. She tried to comfort her. "Matriarch, what's the matter? Please don't get angry over small matters like these." The matriarch tossed the account book in her hands to one side and pointed at it angrily. She let out a long sigh. "Take a look at it yourself. How is that a small matter? You know how much our family assets were worth when I handed them over to her. Look at what she's done to them. The value of our assets have shrunk by at least half. For this whole year, not a single store brought in any profit for us. No wonder she doesn't even have the money to send out the New Year presents." Senior servant Lu took up the account books and flipped through the pages. Soon, her brows were furrowed just like the matriarch's. "How can this be? How could we have such heavy losses? Still, you should calm down, matriarch. You know that eldest young madam isn't good at managing businesses." Forget it. Who told Dalong to have done such a sorry thing to her? Go and get my personal account books from the drawers." The matriarch flipped through the personal account book in her hands and pointed at a few parts. "Tell the steward to give all these to Madame Zhou." Senior servant Lu was watching carefully the whole time. When she heard so, she pressed her lips together like she had something to say. Matriarchy glanced at her. "What's wrong? What is it that you can't say in front of me now?" This old servant doesn't dare. But this old servant was just thinking, if you give all these to eldest young madam, then what about Miss Ing? The matriarch froze for a moment. Miss Ing was matriarchy's only daughter, and she had married far away to Xiyang. Back when she had gotten married, something had happened that had caused matriarchy to stop all contact with her daughter for many years. After so many years, senior servant Lu had still kept the habit of calling the past eldest miss of House Jingon by her maiden title, Miss Ing. Half a month ago, Miss Ing had sent a letter home, saying that her husband had passed away from illness and that her husband's family had fallen into ruin. She wanted to bring her daughter back to her maiden home to live out the rest of her days. Things had happened so long ago and her son-in-law was already gone. Miss Ing was still matriarch, his very own daughter after all. How could the matriarch bear to ignore her for the rest of her life? Thus, the soft-hearted matriarch had sent a letter and some servants to bring Miss Ing and her daughter back to the capital to celebrate the new year together. The matriarch stayed in a daze for a long time, as if she had slipped back into her memories. Finally, she spoke up. "For all the assets under my name, which store is the most profitable right now?" Senior servant Lu replied truthfully, "You have 2 silk stores and 2 grain stores under your name, as well as a dried medicinal herb store. As for the most profitable one, that would have to be that old Gillen restaurant that you gave to third young madam." Chapter 416. Not Stupid 1. The profits from Gillen restaurant were helping with the burden of Countess Jingan's medicine expenses now, and the matriarch had handed the deed for the restaurant over to Chu Lian back then. If she were to take it back and put it into the public accounts now, it wouldn't be appropriate. Matriarchy thought of how Chu Lian was still in the north and sighed. "Shangyun, what should I do?" Senior servant Lu frowned. It took a short while for her to reply. "How about putting 2 months of Gillen restaurant's profits into the public funds for now? When third young madam returns from the north, matriarch can return Gillen restaurant to her. How does that sound?" Matriarchy's lit up and she nodded immediately. "Let's do that." The matriarch's private assets weren't infinite either. Their whole family wasn't good at business. She had used her private funds to make up for shortfalls here and there, and she still had to leave enough for He Erlang's wedding. There really wasn't much left. As for Miss Ying's matter, although her daughter hadn't lived up to her expectations when she was younger, that was still a child she had carried for 10 months in her womb. Now that her daughter had left her husband's family and had no other support in the world, along with her newly come-of-age daughter, she had to stretch her funds to account for Miss Ying as well now that she was coming back. Children would always be a debt for their parents. As rational as matriarchy was normally, when it came to her own daughter, she just couldn't make her usual clear-headed decisions. Mu Xiang, come with me to Gillen Restaurant later, senior servant Lu instructed. Mu Xiang had been doing needlework in the corner. She seemed a little dazed, and she didn't respond for quite some time. Senior servant Lu shot a glance at the girl when she didn't get a reply. Upon noticing her odd behavior, she found it weird and asked, Mu Xiang, what's wrong? Are you feeling unwell? It was only then that Mu Xiang returned to her senses. She shook her head and replied respectfully, Matriarch Momo, this servant is fine. Senior servant Lu laughed and joked, don't tell me that you're occupied with thoughts of your marriage now that you're all grown up. Don't worry. You're the most capable maid under our matriarch. When you marry someday, she'll definitely treat you well. Mu Xiang acted shyly in response. That's not it at all, Momo. This servant is going to serve matriarch forever. Matriarchy smiled and poked her forehead. All right, stop that silly talk. Make a trip down to Gillen Restaurant this afternoon with Shang Yun and explain things clearly to the steward there. Take these 10 taels of silver and buy more clothes and accessories for yourselves. Senior servant Lu smiled and led Mu Xiang in a grateful bob to the matriarch. On the night of the Kitchen God Festival, a few days before New Year's Eve, it was rare for all the masters of the Jingon estate who were in the capital to be home at the same time. They all gathered at the parlor in the outer court for a meal. However, there was a single seat that remained empty. Countess Jingon was still bedridden due to her fit of anger at Madame Zhou's actions previously. Only Dalong's family and matriarch were seated at the large round table. The pregnant Miaojin was currently kept by Countess Jingan's side so that her pregnancy could go smoothly. There was a subtle pressure in the air that made the entire meal uncomfortable. Matriarch sighed deeply. Dalong, do you have any news of Erlang and Sanlang? Changqi knew that his grandmother was worried for them. The He family already had very few members to being with. Yet the men of the family were all fighting hard in distant lands, away from the family. Changqi knew he couldn't really share every single detail to his grandmother. Of course, he would only report the good news while withholding the bad. Grandmother, please don't worry. Erlang is currently investigating a case with Prince Jin in Zhangzhou. They've already found some clues, so if there aren't any unexpected incidents, he should be able to come back for the new year. Third sister-in-law is still in the north, so Sanlang has someone to take care of him. The matriarch let out another long sigh. She couldn't muster up any appetite, so she set down her chopsticks and reached out behind her, signaling for Mu Xiang to help her stand. It's getting late and my old body is tired. Eat slowly, you two. They'll be heading back to rest. Don't forget to visit your mother after you're done eating. Grandson understands. Please walk carefully, grandmother. All right, don't bother with sending me off. Spend more time with your wife and children. Not long after the matriarch had left, Changqi got up and left in huge strides, without even glancing back at Madame Zhou. Madame Zhou stared at Changqi's retreating back with hatred as her nails dug angrily into her palm. Within Songtao Court, senior servants Gue and Zhong were leading the whole courtyard of maidservants in the celebrations for the new year. Since their masters weren't around and they were all servants, the two stewards didn't dare to make too much of a fuss over the festivities. They simply sat down together with the other servants and had a good meal together, and that was the end of it. When they were done with the meal, the two senior servants and the few handmaids were tidying things up in the warm room. Xian wrote down some records in an account book with a serious expression before placing all the accounts that had been sent over from Gillen Restaurant on the table. Senior servants Gue and Zhong were working on some new clothes for Chu Lian at the side. One of them smiled and asked, "So how much did third young Madame's Gillen Restaurant earn last month?" When this was mentioned, Xian first reacted by freezing up, then taking a deep breath to calm the fires raging in her heart. "Momo, don't talk about that anymore. No matter how much Gillen Restaurant has earned last month, it has nothing to do with our third young madam. The senior servants exchanged bewildered looks before they spoke up. Why not? It was third young madam who single-handedly made Gillen Restaurant what it is. Although she borrowed the restaurant that the matriarch gifted to her, the deed is still under third young madam's name. Chapter 417. Not Stupid 2. Xian was clearly still huffy over the whole matter. Her usual calm and generosity was completely non-existent as she snorted. So what if it belongs to our third young madam? Our third young madam is the most junior in this family, so she can't beat the senior family members. See, with one word from matriarch He, a whole month of profits from our third young madam's Gillen Restaurant have been confiscated for the public funds. They didn't even leave a single silver behind. Senior servants Gue and Zhong were astounded. They hadn't expected matriarch He to have done so. To be honest, even though it was the matriarch who had ordered this, it was still a little too much. Gillen Restaurant now belonged to Chu Lian alone. A shared sense of foreboding appeared in their hearts. Senior servant Zhong mulled over it before saying, "Tell me, what do you think the matriarch means by this? Is she thinking of taking Gillen Restaurant back?" Senior servant Gue and Xian both sunk into silence. Moments later, Xian bit her lower lip and said, "Forget it. Third young madam was already prepared for this even before she left. I thought she was overthinking things back then, but it seems like it's a real possibility. We can't just sit back and do nothing now." Senior servants Gue and Zhong looked at Xian with amazement. Could it be that third young madam had left some instructions for Xian before leaving? Since things had progressed to this stage, there was no need for Xian to continue hiding it anymore. Chu Lian trusted senior servants Gue and Zhong as well. Chu Lian had already considered that a situation like this would happen even before she had left for the north. She had written down some solutions and left them to Xian. She instructed Xian not to use them until she really had to. Xian had never even considered opening that letter before, but now she had no other choice. "All right, Momo. Did you really think that our third young madam is someone who's easy to bully?" Since Xian had said so, the two senior servants' worries turned into smiles. While they were speaking in the warm room, a servant from outside reported that Princess Duanjia's handmaid Jinxiu had come. Joy brightened up Zion's face and she quickly replied, "Invite her in." The three personally went to the entrance to receive her. A short while later, Jinxiu was welcomed into the warm room. A servant brought tea over for their guest. When Jinxiu looked at the three servants, her expression changed subtly and she asked, "The three of you seem rather downcast. Is there something in the estate that's troubling you?" Back when Chu Lian had still been in the capital, she had gotten along the most with royal Princess Duanjia. She had even saved the princess once. When Chu Lian had left for the north, Princess Wei had even specially sent some guards from her estate to follow along. Xian and the others were Chu Lian's most trusted subordinates, so they knew that they didn't have to hide things from Princess Duanjia's servant. They explained the situation with Gillen Restaurant. Jinxiu frowned. Although she was from Prince Wei's estate, even from the perspective of a bystander, matriarch had gone overboard with her actions. "Do you require any assistance from our princess?" Xian hurriedly shook her head. "How could we trouble the royal princess? Our madam isn't someone who would let others bully her just like that. Third young madam left some solutions for us, so we should be able to work things out by ourselves." Jinxiu nodded. "All right, then be careful. We're all servants here. Remember that we don't have the same immunity as our masters." Xian put some dried snacks in front of Jinxiu to let her have a taste. "What have you come over for, Sister Jinxiu?" Jinxiu quickly set down the snacks in her hand and dusted them off. She turned to a lower-ranking maidservant behind her and took a small bag from her. "I was so occupied with chatting that I almost forgot about the task that Princess Wei and Royal Princess have entrusted to me." After saying so, Jinxiu opened up the small bag right in front of the others. There were a few exquisite long boxes and a set of luxurious clothing within. Jinxiu carefully took out the dress first and explained, "This is a dress made from some silk Sichuan brocade that our princess acquired from Yinzhou. There were only 2 outfits made in total, one light yellow and this pink one. Honored lady has the same measurements as our royal princess, so Princess sent me over with one set for honored lady. Xian and the other servants hurriedly accepted the dress and thanked Princess Wei in place of Chu Lian. Even though Chu Lian wasn't in the capital, Princess Wei had been able to think of her even while having dresses made for royal Princess Duanjia. That showed how much Princess Wei favored Chu Lian. Xian, senior servant Gue, and the rest were genuinely happy for Chu Lian over this. They couldn't count on Housing for any support. Now that Princess Wei had become Chu Lian's backer, even if Chu Lian distanced herself from her maiden house, the noble madams and ladies of the capital wouldn't be able to bully her. Jinxiu then opened several of the pear blossom wood boxes. Here is the share of the profits for the jewelry store for this month. Since Honored Lady isn't around, you can keep these for Honored Lady first. The rest of the boxes are all accessories that the master craftsmen of the store have made. These were personally picked out by our royal princess for Honored Lady. Before leaving the capital, Chu Lian had opened up a jewelry store together with royal Princess Duanjia. They had agreed on leaving the management of the storefront and personnel to Princess Duanjia, while Chu Lian was in charge of drawing up new and interesting designs for the jewelry. Although Chu Lian had handed over a stack of designs to royal Princess Duanjia before leaving, the store hadn't opened that month. It wasn't until the start of November that the jewelry store Treasure Pavilion had officially opened. The banknotes that Jinxiu had just sent over were the first time that Chu Lian had received any of the profits from the jewelry store. Xian, senior servant Zhong, and senior servant Gue stared at the thick piles of banknotes in the wooden boxes. They were all slightly dazed from shock. All of this was from just a single month's earnings? Jinxiu seemed to have guessed at their train of thought. She smiled and explained, "You might be surprised now, but if you go over to Treasure Pavilion and take a look for ourselves, you'll realize that this much profit is actually on the lower side. It's almost the new year, so all the noble families in the capital are going to come to the store to make new accessories or headdresses. The earnings for the last month of the year should be at least twice as much as the previous month." Chapter 418, Hurt 1. Xian had no words to describe how amazed she was. She hadn't expected that a store third young madam and royal Princess Duanjia had casually decided to open would actually be so profitable. Could their third young madam somehow be the reincarnation of the god of wealth? Jinxiu took in Zion's slack jaw and glared at her rebukingly. "It's not really that much. Don't tell me that Gillen Restaurant earns less than this in a month." Xian looked a little embarrassed as she replied, "Well, no," she sighed inwardly. Wasn't it precisely because Gillen Restaurant earned so much that they were facing these troubles now? While third young madam was still away from the capital, others were eyeing the restaurant. Jinxiu didn't stay for too long. She left after an hour of chatting and tea. Right after the Kitchen God Festival, Gillen Restaurant suddenly shut its business down on the very next day. A die-hard group of their customers squatted in front of the doors of Gillen Restaurant early in the morning. It was only when the ancient doors remained shut even after noon had already come and gone that they finally gave up and left with many laments. Actually, while most businesses would shut down for the New Year celebrations, for restaurants and inns, they would usually wait till after the last 2 days of the year before shutting down. After that, they would usually open their businesses on the 5th day of the new year. However, going by the sign that Gillen Restaurant had hung on its doors, they were going to close right when the New Year celebrations had just started, and they would be undergoing renovation right at the start of the year. They didn't even reveal when they would open again. Even though the customers gathered outside Gillen Restaurant were brimming with anger, Gillen Restaurant had always gone by its own rules, and they had never bent them for anyone. Gillen Restaurant likely wouldn't change their minds, even if the customers were to charge in and demand an explanation. Furthermore, Gillen Restaurant had somehow been emptied out completely in the span of a single night. Not one person could be found in the restaurant now. It was clear that the staff had known about this for a while. On the same day, when it was almost 11 a.m., old Duke Zheng rode his simple blue carriage over to the rear entrance of Gillen Restaurant. The servant driving the horses stopped the carriage and went over to knock on their doors, like he had done many times before. In a short moment, the doors were opened from within by a manservant dressed in blue. However, this time, the blue manservant didn't come up to lead old Duke Zheng's carriage away. Instead, He bowed deeply towards old Duke Zheng's servant with an apology written all over his face. Your Grace, our most sincere apologies. Our humble business will be closed from today onwards. Old Duke Zheng had just alighted from his carriage when these words hit him like a ton of bricks. His wrinkled yet spirited eyes glared at the manservant as he said, What? What do you mean closed? Since you're running a restaurant, why aren't you open for business? Are you trying to slack off while your owner isn't in the capital? The corners of the blue manservant's lips twitched, and he continued respectfully, That's not possible, Your Grace. We servants would love to work more and earn more money. We wouldn't dare to skive. This decision didn't come from us, but from third young madam herself. We humbly beg for your understanding, Your Grace. Once the blue manservant had given his explanation, old Duke Zheng frowned. He grumbled lightly, What is that girl doing now? Following that, he turned to ask the blue manservant, Are there any chefs left in Gillen restaurant? Upon hearing this, the blue manservant knew that the old duke hadn't given up. He could only grit his teeth and reply, Your Grace, all the staff in Gillen restaurant have already left. Only this servant and a few old servants have been kept here to look after the building. In the end, old Duke Zheng had no other choice but to return to his own estate with a very stormy expression. On this day, the blue manservant had to hold off at least 20 more waves of noble customers who had come to have a meal at Gillen. Next to Gillen restaurant, in a private room on the second floor of a newly opened tea house, a middle-aged man harumphed. He slammed the porcelain teacup in his hands back on the table, causing the tea within to slosh out and spill. The middle-aged man's voice was low and husky, filled with a domineering aura that only someone of a high status would have. Yang Yinfeng. So this is the restaurant famed all over the capital that you've brought us to? So famous that it has shut down? Lord Yang coughed awkwardly. Your Majesty, please forgive me. This humble subject did not expect Gillen restaurant to have shut down so suddenly. The man who had foregone his imperial robes in favor of more ordinary clothing sitting opposite Lord Yang was the current ruler of the Great Wu dynasty, the Chengping Emperor. The emperor was dressed in a low-key gray brocade robe today, with a simple white jade crown on his hair. He looked just like any other rich nobleman. If not for the imposing aura that he wore like a cloak, he looked like a handsome, finely aged man. Through the slats of the windows, the Chengping Emperor's sharp eagle eyes narrowed as they focused on Gillen restaurant's rear entrance. Very well. So this is where all his good subjects had been running to after morning court to enjoy themselves. They had been sat here for 2 hours. Just look at the people who had come knocking on those doors. Dukes, great generals, the head of the secretariat, the minister of transport, many of his cabinet and trusted officials. Even the reclusive and lofty scholars who never stepped out of their studies had come. The Chengping Emperor didn't understand how a restaurant tucked away in such a remote alley was so enticing to all of his subjects. All manner of important people were rushing up to their doors. Any one of them could make the entire capital shake if they simply stomped their feet. Could these people be trying something behind his back, rather than coming here merely for a meal? However, it didn't seem quite right the more he looked at it. If they were trying to plot something, why would they bring empty food containers along with them? They were clearly planning to bring home another set of food after eating their fill. Chapter 419, Hurt 2 That. What's his name? Wasn't that Li Xiuxian from the west suburbs? The Chengping Emperor had sent envoys 3 times to invite that sour scholar to become the prince's private tutor, but that old fellow had kept refusing to move like a stubborn old tortoise. Well, look now. A simple restaurant's dishes had somehow lured him out of his home. Look at how that old fellow's body trembled as he got off his carriage. He looked like he was about to be blown away by the wind any second now, but he didn't fall. Instead, he stood in front of Gillen restaurant's rear entrance, full of energy and spirit. The Chengping Emperor was about to faint from the sheer intensity of his anger. As Lord Yang watched clouds gather over the emperor's face, he smiled bitterly and sighed. He could only do his best to persuade the emperor and say, Your Majesty, perhaps we should return to the palace first. It looks like Gillen restaurant has really shut its doors. There's no meaning in waiting any longer. However, The Chongping Emperor remained stubborn as a mule. We'll sit for a while longer. We want to see which gluttons are going to show up now. Cold sweat was running down Lord Yang's forehead. He lit a candle in mourning for his comrades who had come to Gillen Restaurant and been met with closed doors today. Yinfeng, does the food in this Gillen Restaurant hold such attraction? Half of my court has been enticed here. The Chongping Emperor felt a little uneasy. When Lord Yang heard such a question from the Emperor, he tried his best to reply, "If your Majesty might allow me to be bold, this humble subject thinks that even the imperial cooks in your Majesty's palace can't compare." He had come to Gillen several times himself ever since Gillen had opened. As busy as he might be, he would definitely come to Gillen Restaurant every month with his wife to have a meal. There were small private courtyards in Gillen Restaurant, separated from other courtyards. Furthermore, their soundproofing and the way they had designed the place were excellent. Even if he knew that many of his colleagues came here to eat as well, if he didn't make the effort to meet and greet them, they would never bump into each other while in Gillen. If he were not kept busy by official business, Lord Yang would have liked to come to Gillen Restaurant every day for meals. Unfortunately, most of them couldn't enjoy their lives like old Duke Sheng, taking all 3 meals of the day there and practically living in Gillen Restaurant. When the Chongping Emperor heard Lord Yang's appraisal, he was taken aback. Better than the imperial cooks. How could he leave it be now? Once he thought of how his subjects were eating better than him, the very ruler of this dynasty, the Chongping Emperor felt a huge sense of unfairness. So all of you have been eating such delicacies every day. What loyal subjects you are. Lord Yang had simply spoke the truth. He hadn't expected his frank admission to have provoked the Emperor somehow. He gulped anxiously. Keeping the Emperor company was really like lying next to a wild tiger. Your Majesty, this is the only indulgence this humble subject has. Furthermore, now that Gillen Restaurant has shut down, it won't be possible to come here any longer. The Chongping Emperor only felt slightly better after staring at the tightly closed doors of the restaurant. Who's the one behind such an impressive restaurant? When Lord Yang saw that the Emperor had dropped the previous topic, he relaxed and quickly replied, "Actually, Your Majesty has already met the owner of this restaurant." "Oh? Tell me more." Lord Yang smiled. "It's the lady you've personally named, Honored Lady Jeannie." Jeannie? When that familiar face popped back into the Emperor's mind, his mind went into a daze for a moment. By the time he regained his senses, there was a slight upward curve to his lips. "So it's that girl. Where is she? Send someone to call her here. We will question her and see why that silly girl has shut down the restaurant." Lord Yang tried to hold back his sweat. "Your Majesty, Honored Lady Jeannie has gone to the northern border. She's not in the capital now." "What? She's gone to Liangzhou in the north?" The Chongping Emperor started frowning deeply. With his fearsome gaze focused on Lord Yang was starting to feel unwell. He could only harden up his courage and try explaining the situation. Luckily, he had some connection with Chu Lian. Otherwise, he wouldn't know how to explain everything. "She's been gone for 2 or 3 months. Your Majesty might have forgotten that He Sanlang is in Liangzhou right now." When the situation in the north changed, the He matriarch must have felt uneasy, so she requested the Empress Dowager to pass down a decree for Honored Lady Jeannie to head to Liangzhou. Even so, how could she send a young lady to the north? What nonsense is House Jingon thinking? Lord Yang didn't know what to say. Helpless, he replied, "Your Majesty, there's no one else House Jingon can send other than Honored Lady Jeannie." When the Chongping Emperor was reminded of this fact by Lord Yang, realization dawned upon him. His eyes narrowed. Even though he now knew that matriarch he hadn't had any other choice, he still felt disgruntled. Honored Lady Jeannie was considered part of their imperial family after all, since he had personally given her her title. How could she be sent to and fro just like that by that old biddy in the He family? Since their conversation had turned to the topic of the war in the north, the Emperor lost the mood to remain in disguise. He brought Lord Yang with him as he returned back to his estate. Once the Kitchen God Festival was over, time passed fleetingly. In the blink of an eye, 5 days had passed and it was almost New Year's Eve. Even in the main camp of the border troops, the mood had turned festive and the army cooks had all started preparing the food they would need for New Year's Eve. However, at this time, Chu Lian seemed to be rather listless. She had been kept busy by the preparations for the past few days. Now that they were done, her mood had sunk quite low. It had been 10 days since He Changdi had left, and he wasn't back yet. Going by the news that Laiwa had brought, the snow mountain mist flower on Mount Aming should have wilted yesterday. Although Chu Lian had both hands stuffed into a rabbit fur tube with a little hand warmer to boot, she still felt cold all over. She had been asking Wenqing and Wanlan to check at the entrance every day. She had even gone so far as to send someone to the border camp to ask after He Changdi. The servants' reports had left her disappointed each time. Chu Lian sat against the warm hearth bed, lacking the mood to do anything at all. She tried hard to remember all the details in the story she had read, but unfortunately, the book had never mentioned the northern border in detail. While she was still in a daze, Manager Qin came running into the room in a panic, all etiquette having flown out of his mind. Terror and anxiety filled his face as he said, Third young madam, please come with me. Quickly. Third young master is hurt. Chapter 420. Treatment 1. Chu Lian's expression abruptly changed. She hadn't expected He Changdi to get hurt. Before Manager Qin could say any more, she leaped from the hearthbed, even forgetting to put on her shoes in her haste. Quick, lead me there. Manager Qin had only given the situation in the outer court a cursory glance before rushing over to report to Chu Lian. The only thing he knew was that third young master was badly injured. When He Changdi had been brought in by the guards, he was already in a coma. Without knowing more about his condition, Manager Qin didn't dare to say anything else to Chu Lian. Thus, on the journey to the outer court, the atmosphere remained somber and tense. Once they reached the central room of the outer court, they were met with the sight of a group of guards surrounding the soft bed in the center of the room. Amongst them was a sorry-looking Imo Chengue, who stood to one side with an expression full of self-blame and guilt. When Chu Lian saw the slender figure lying in the center, her mind went completely blank. She hurried over to check on He Changdi's injuries. The usual humor in her almond-shaped eyes was gone, replaced with anger and worry. The guards surrounding He Changdi shifted away upon seeing that it was their young madam who had come. Before Imo Chengue could explain, Chu Lian was already throwing out questions in a cold tone. Where is he injured? Hurry up and call for a physician. Imo Chengue moved his mouth without speaking at first, looking close to sobbing. When Chu Lian shot him a fierce glare, he gritted his teeth and replied, Third young master fell from the mountain. The worst injury is on his right thigh, and there are a few smaller injuries all over his body. We've already called a physician. He'll be here soon. Chu Lian cast a cold look at him before shifting away. Right now, she wasn't in the mood to ask what exactly had happened on Mount Aming and how He Sanlang had gotten into this state. She ignored the customary reserve between men and women and reached out to take off He Changdi's clothes. When Manager Qin noticed her movements, he knew that third young madam wanted to inspect the wounds herself. Manager Qin was one of the calmer ones present. He quickly ushered the guards out and called Wenqing and Wanlan in to help. Imo Chengue rushed over to stop Chu Lian when he realized that she wanted to check on He Changdi's wounds herself. She wasn't a doctor, and third young master was injured all over. If she made his injuries worse by accident, he could die from it. However, before Imo Chengue could reach Chu Lian, he was held back by Manager Qin. The space between Manager Qin's brows was tightly furrowed as he stated coldly, Leader Imo, third young madam knows what she's doing. The physician hasn't arrived yet, but third young master's wounds can't wait. But what? Are you going to tell me that you know what to do? Imo Chengue finally sunk into silence. How could he possibly know what to do in this case? The extent of his medical knowledge was to cover up any areas that were bleeding with bandages. If he were a physician, would he have waited until now to take action? Once Manager Qin saw that he had been placated, he ushered him off to one side and said, Rest here, Leader Imo. When the doctor comes, third young madam will definitely have some questions for you. Although there weren't any deadly wounds on Imo Chengue's body, he cut a sorry figure. He likely had some hidden wounds underneath his rumpled clothing. The thick fur cloak on him had traces of dried blood all over. With Wenqing and Wanlan as her helping hands, Chu Lian worked fast. Changdi was covered in blood stains, and there were cuts all over his body. Some of the wounds had been left exposed to the elements and were frostbitten, exacerbating his condition. However, Chu Lian simply couldn't bring herself to think about the smaller wounds now. She took a deep breath to keep calm. Taking a pair of scissors from Wenqing, she began carefully cutting his right pants leg while making sure to avoid contact with his wounds. Chapter 421. Treatment 2. The pants leg was covered in numerous cuts, and blood from the wound had caused more than half of the cloth to be stuck to his leg. There were also parts that were stuck directly to his wounds. Chu Lian clenched her teeth and mustered up the courage to pull it off in one go. The unconscious He Sanlang was covered in cold sweat. There was an unnatural flush on his cheeks, and his lips were pale and cracked. These were the signs of a high fever. Wenlan ordered a servant to bring in a few more braziers, then placed a towel soaked with cold water on He Changda's forehead. Chu Lian pursed her lips tightly, holding back her tears with everything she had. After cutting for approximately 5 minutes, she finally managed to cut off the clothing stuck to his wounds, revealing his entire right leg. His right leg was badly mangled from thigh to calf. She couldn't even see a single patch of clean skin. Everything was covered in blood. Chu Lian had gone through special training for emergency first aid in the wilderness before. Although she couldn't match the treatment a medical professional might provide, she could still patch up his wounds before a doctor arrived. She asked Wenqing and Wenlan to search for some supplies before she began tending to He Changda's thigh. Before long, the condition of his thigh and calf was stabilized. Those who remained in the room were all Chu Lian's trusted servants, so nobody questioned Chu Lian's decisions. Even though Amo Chungue had tried to object, his objection had already been quelled by Manager Qin. By the time Chu Lian finished, an old physician with a snow-white beard was helped in by 2 guards. Chu Lian quickly welcomed him in. This physician was a familiar face. He had been the one to see to the wound on Chu Lian's ankle, and he was an experienced old physician who was skillful with external wounds. "Sir, please take a look at my husband's wounds," Chu Lian said as she supported the physician to the bed. When the old physician saw that the wounds on the patient's right thigh had already been cleaned, he seemed astonished. Who tended to these wounds? The question from the unknowing physician lit a fire in Imo Chenggui's heart. He thought that the physician meant that Chu Lian had made the condition of He Changda's wounds even worse. He immediately stood up to face Chu Lian with a fierce glare. Chu Lian completely disregarded his angry look. Instead, she focused on suppressing her own anxiety and remaining calm. "Sir, it was me." The old physician raised his head to glance at Chu Lian. He nodded with approval. "Madam, you've done very well. You must have studied a little about medicine before. I didn't bring any of my assistants in my rush to come here, so we'll need to trouble you in a bit." Chu Lian quickly nodded and took off her loose outer robe, which would only get in the way. She changed into a more flexible tunic. Imo Chungue was stupefied. It was completely out of his expectations that a young lady like third young madam would actually have some medical knowledge at the tender age of 16. However, since the old physician had said so, he believed it. For a moment, he felt rather guilty. Manager Qin glanced at him with contempt. For some reason, Manager Qin just couldn't get along with Leader Imo. He just couldn't see eye to eye with this old ruffian no matter how much he tried. The old physician didn't like how crowded the room was, so he only allowed Chu Lian and Wenqing to stay while everybody else was chased out of the room. After a whole 2 hours, the old physician finally exited the room with the support of Wenqing, while the weary Chu Lian came out right behind them. The moment the door was opened, Imo Chungue and Manager Qin anxiously went up to them. Imo Chungue asked apprehensively, "Doctor, how is third young master?" The old physician looked him up and down. When he saw that the middle-aged man also seemed to be covered in wounds, he rattled out a list of complaints. "Were you involved with bringing the patient back here? Don't you know how to take care of someone? If that young man in there had stayed on horseback for just half a day longer, you can forget about keeping his right leg. Luckily, your madam arrived just in time to take care of those wounds. Otherwise, even if I were Hua Tu or reborn, I wouldn't have been able to keep that leg. A fine young man would have been crippled just like that." TL note. Hua Tuo is a historical figure who was famous for his skill in medicine. So the doctor is just trying to say that Sanlang's leg would have been past the point of saving if his wounds had been left untreated for half a day more. Hua Tuo is a very interesting person, and there's a Wikipedia article that summarizes most of his life story, which also involves Cao Cao of Three Kingdoms fame. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/1. Chapter 422. Taking Care of He Sanlang 1. Although Mo Chungue wasn't happy to be the subject of the old physician's nagging, he understood that He Changda's condition had taken a turn for the better thanks to Chu Lian. He hastily lowered his head in apology. Chu Lian pressed her palm to her forehead, clearly fatigued. She shot a signal at Manager Qin with her eyes. Manager Qin caught on to her intentions and quickly helped the old physician to a room nearby for some tea and snacks. The old physician was skilled at his craft, but he seemed to enjoy prattling on a little too much, perhaps due to his age. Chu Lian still had questions for Mo Chungue, so she couldn't just let the old physician ramble on like that. Once the old physician was out of sight, Chu Lian called Mo Chungue to the study for a chat. He Changdi had suffered severe injuries. Despite the fact that his condition had been stabilized, it wasn't good to move him at this point. There was no way for him to return to the Northern Border Army for now, so they would have to send a messenger to notify them. Sometime later, He Changdi was moved off into a side room. Chu Lian took on the task of feeding him herself and used a teapot with a narrow spout to pour the medicine straight into his mouth. After she fed him a total of 3 bowls worth of medicine, she touched his forehead and sighed in relief. He Sanlang's high fever had finally broken. When Chu Lian set the special teapot aside, her gaze was attracted by a long box that had been placed on the side table. She sat on the stool beside the bed, picked up the box, and carefully opened it. 2 pure white flowers with layers upon layers of petals were laid out on a velvety red fabric. They were only about the size of her thumb. Although their shape somewhat resembled cherry blossoms, these were much prettier. According to Great Dr. Miao, the Snow Mountain Mist's flower supposedly grew bright red on its tree, and it only turned a pure white 2 days after it was picked if it had reached full bloom. It was a very magical existence. When He Changdi had led his men up Mount Aming, the arduous journey had taken most of their strength and energy. Right at the moment when they were picking the flowers, they had been ambushed. It was clear that the enemy had been lying in wait for some time. Most of the attackers had been Tu Huns, but there had also been several masked people from the Great Wu. They were most likely trained assassins. Although He Changdi had brought elite fighters with him too, they had already used up most of their stamina on the journey there. To make things worse, they were on a mountain peak where the air was thin. They struggled against the enemies for as long as they could, but the odds were stacked against them. The enemies were ruthless and fearless. In the end, there were only 4 people left on He Changda's side. As powerful as He Sanlang was, it was impossible for him to contend against so many enemies alone, so they had no choice but to flee. As they were fending off the Tu Han assassins, He Changda's thigh had been pierced by a sword. He Changdi then ordered Mo Chungue to bring the Snow Mountain Mist's flowers back while he stayed to hold off their pursuers. Mo Chungue had been left with no choice but to take the Snow Mountain Mists and escape first. The enemy seemed to have come just for He Changdi, as none of them chased after Mo Chungue. Once he got away from them, it took Mo Chungue half a day to find He Changdi by the tracks he left behind. Eventually, Mo Chungue found his young master in a pile of snow. Somehow, He Changdi had actually managed to survive the whole ordeal by hiding in this thick pile of snow. By his side were 2 frozen Tu Han corpses. When Mo Chungue finally found the blood-soaked He Sanlang, his eyes had filled with tears. Later on, it was Mo Chungue and 2 other old soldiers who transported He Changdi back. Chu Lian shut the lid of the wooden box and carefully put away the life-saving medicinal herbs. A glint of light passed through her limpid, almond-shaped eyes. Her usual smile was gone, replaced with a grave expression. Assassins had ambushed He Changdi on Mount Aming, and there had been a group of Tu Huns with them. There were very few people who knew that they had come out to the northern border to look for the Snow Mountain Mist's flower, and most of them were within their circle of trust. Even Prince Jin's subordinate, Tang Yin, didn't know about their mission. The only ones in the army who were in the know were Captain Guo, Zhang Mai, and Xiao Hongyu. They had only mentioned it to Great General Qian in private when He Changdi had departed. None of them had any motive to attack He Changdi. Furthermore, those two Huns had already been lying in wait near the Snow Mountain Mist's flowers, so it was clear that they had been prepared beforehand. When she thought back to the people who had kidnapped her, Chu Lian's eyes were filled with a dangerous aura. Xiao Bojian, as far as she knew, the only one who would use such despicable methods to achieve their goals was him. But how had he known that He Sanlang would be going up Mount Aming to pick the Snow Mountain Mists? It was impossible for anyone here in the north to leak that information, so it had to be someone back in the capital. With that, the list of suspects was narrowed down greatly. It had to be someone in the Jinggan estate. While Chu Lian was immersed in her thoughts, Wan Lan entered the room carrying some clean clothes with her. She called out softly to Chu Lian, who blinked and returned to the present. She turned to Wan Lan. Third young madam, Laiwa has already set off for the army camp to inform them about Third Young Master's situation. These are some of Third Young Master's clean clothes. Do you want to change them now? Chu Lian nodded and handed over the box of Snow Mountain Mist's flowers to Wan Lan, ordering her to keep them hidden well. Put down the clothes and bring some hot water over. The walls of this side room were heated, so it wasn't cold in here at all. Chu Lian brought a pair of scissors over to the bedside before pulling the blanket off He Changdi's body. The old physician had left behind plenty of salves and had told Chu Lian to apply them to He Changdi's smaller wounds, which were littered all over. In order to access them, He Changdi would need to be stripped. Fortunately, there was a convenient way to do this. When Chu Lian had been tending to the injury on his thigh earlier, she hadn't had the time to change him out of his torn, dirty, blood-stained clothes. Thus, it would be easier to simply cut them off and throw them away than to carefully strip him of them. Chapter 423. Taking care of He Sanlang, 2. Chu Lian worked quickly and managed to get He Sanlang's outer robe off. When she could finally see the dark green undershirt he was wearing, she was slightly startled. The square patterns embroidered on the collar were so crooked that they looked like furry little worms instead. Wasn't this the shirt that Li Yu had practiced on? He Changdi was actually wearing it. Judging from how worn the edges of the cloth seemed to be, she could guess that he wore this shirt quite often. He couldn't possibly have worn these clothes for so long because he thought that I was the one who made them, right? Chu Lian covered her face with a hand. Considering He Changdi's fickle temperament, she didn't dare to tell him the truth behind the shirt now. Thus, she followed the mantra in for a penny, in for a pound, and simply destroyed the shirt. This lousily embroidered shirt that He Changdi wore the most was cut to shreds by the indignant Chu Lian. Although He Changdi looked like a tall, skinny man, his body was actually brimming with hidden strength once his clothes were stripped away. Though his muscles weren't overly large, they gave him an underlying aura of power. Even though he was covered in tiny little cuts and scratches from his chest down to his waist, Chu Lian felt her cheeks heating up from looking at his body. She murmured under her breath, "Isn't He Sanlang's figure a little too perfect?" An 8-pack of abs sat on his abdomen. They didn't look very obvious because he was lying prone right now. Then there were the 2 alluring lines on either side of his waist, leading down further. Even though Chu Lian was treating He Changdi as a patient right now, she couldn't help the blush that spread across her face. She moved faster and stripped He Sanlang in record time before panicking and throwing the blanket over his excellent figure. By this time, Wan Lan had returned with the hot water. Third young madam, haste the hot water. The salves are on the side table. This servant has some tasks at hand, so this servant won't be able to help. If third young madam has any orders, just call this servant. Once she finished speaking, Wan Lan vanished from the side room. The speed of her disappearance left Chu Lian agape. Wan Lan thoughtfully shut the doors, leaving He Changdi and Chu Lian alone in the room. She hunched her shoulders and chuckled evilly. Since there was a chance, she had to let third young master and third young madam spend more time together. Even though she was just a maidservant, she had noticed that there was something wrong between the couple. They had been here in the north for so many days, yet they had never once spent the night together. It wasn't as if third young master didn't have any opportunities to stay overnight. either. From her objective point of view, the problem definitely wasn't a lack of passion between the two. Third young master had been furious upon hearing that third young madam had been kidnapped. She and her sister, Winching, had been scared stiff by the bloodlust in his eyes. Although third young madam was still young, she didn't seem to be interested in much in particular, apart from cooking gourmet food. She had never really put her full attention into anything else, even when it came to making money. However, when it came to matters that concerned third young master, she had actually gotten so worried that it had been written all over her face. Third young madam had even personally thought of a plan to solve his problems. Didn't that mean something? Since the couple clearly had each other in their hearts, then all they needed was a good opportunity. They were already married anyway. If they got along well enough, there might even be a baby born next year. There were still no male heirs in the next generation of House Jingon yet. If their third young madam managed to produce the first one, wouldn't the matriarch favor third young master's branch even more? Thus, Wanlan had specially left the couple alone at this time. Chu Lian could almost feel the sweat dripping down her forehead. Wenlin's thoughts were as clear as day to her. However, she didn't mind it for now. Her first priority was to get He Changdi healed up. She glanced at the basin of hot water on the table before resigning herself to the manual labor. Chu Lian used a warm wet towel to wipe off all the dirt on He Sanlang's body. When he was all clean, she started applying medicine to his wounds. When evening fell, the old physician came by to check up on his patient again. Although He Sanlang was still unconscious, his high fever was gone by now. To Chu Lian, the old physician explained, "Madam, as long as the patient's fever doesn't return tonight, his condition will be stable from tomorrow onwards. He'll just have to focus on recovery from then on." Chu Lian thanked the old physician and ordered Manger Qin to send him off personally. After she had her dinner, Chu Lian stayed by He Sanlang's bedside. When Li Xing, Li Yu, and Manager Qin saw that she was going to take the grueling night watch, they were about to offer to take Chu Lian's place, but Wenqing and Wanlan held them back. "What are you poking your noses into? It's enough to have third young madam alone to care for third young master. Don't worry, my sister and I will keep watch in the outer room through the night. If there's any news, we'll let you know immediately." Since Wanlan had given her guarantee, the group of people backed down and went off to bed. Chu Lian told Wanlan to move a chaise next to He Changda's bed. It was warm inside the room, so she didn't need extra blankets. A thin blanket draped over her body was sufficient. Chu Lian picked up a book of folk stories and leaned against the chaise to read. She touched He Changda's forehead and palms from time to check if his fever returned. It was fact, however, that Chu Lian had already gotten used to sleeping early. She had already yawned countless of times before it had even reached midnight. In order to keep awake, Chu Lian ate some sour candied fruit, but even so, she only managed to hang on till after midnight. When she finally couldn't take it anymore, she laid sideways on the chaise and fell asleep. When Wenqing noticed that there were no more sounds of activity coming from the room, she crept in silently and tucked the thin blanket more securely over Chu Lian. She checked He Changda's temperature before leaving as quietly as she had come. Sometime before daybreak, when the skies were at their darkest, the comatose He Changdi finally opened his eyes with great difficulty. His vision was still rather blurry, but the first thing he noticed was the face that he had been yearning to see the most. Chapter 424. Taking Care of He Sanlang 3. He Sanlang fell back into a dazed state for a moment. He thought he was dreaming. The wound on his leg was actually very serious, so even he thought that it was the end of the line for him. If not for his strong will to live, those attackers would really have achieved their goal and offed him once and for all. At the critical moment, thoughts of what would happen to Chu Lian when he was gone had flashed into his mind. She would most likely be kidnapped by Xiao Bojian, or even locked up into a dungeon somewhere. Those thoughts had pushed him to fight to keep his consciousness and to live. He opened his eyes again. This time, he didn't open them slowly. Instead, he flicked them open impatiently. When light filtered into his eyes and his vision cleared, revealing Chu Lian's lovely sleeping visage once again, He Changda's dull eyes immediately lit up with the spark of life. So it wasn't a dream. It was real. He had survived. And Chu Lian was right by his side. Those wide, limpid eyes of hers were shut tightly now. Her thick eyelashes were still, casting a shadow on her cheeks. Her breathing was slow and shallow, and the puffs of air she exhaled were warming up his face, even as her cheeks were flushed red. Even up close, her skin remained as fair and smooth as it looked from afar. It looked as flawless as a boiled egg, giving him the urge to reach out and pinch her cheeks, just to see if they were as soft and smooth as they looked. Especially now when Chu Lien was in the middle of deep slumber, and her face was relaxed into an innocent and harmless expression. It made him feel even more like teasing her. While He Sanlang's mind was still processing these thoughts, his palm had already slunk out of the blankets and was reaching towards Chu Lien's tender cheeks. The callous tips of his fingers gently touched Chu Lien's fair face. His pupils dilated, and he couldn't help sliding his fingers down her raised nose bridge and tapping her slightly parted pink lips. That soft and smooth sensation on his fingertips sent a bolt of lightning through his body, transmitting a numb feeling from his arm down into his heart, making his heart beat faster. Changdi shifted his body and bore with the pain of the injury on his thigh so he could see the sleeping Chu Lien better. Time seemed to have stopped in this moment. Changdi couldn't keep his hands off of Chu Lien's sleeping face. He just couldn't stop himself from reaching out to touch her face here and there. The millennial ice on his face seemed to have thawed into a gentle and warm expression. The strangest thing of all was that the corner of his lips had lifted into a smile without his knowing. He looked exactly like a man enamored with his lover, who would do anything for her sake. It was completely unlike what he had shown Chu Lien so far. Luckily, Chu Lien was asleep right now. Otherwise, she would probably get the shock of her life from such a terrifying sight. Although He Sanlang constantly acted cold and indifferent, he was actually like a blank piece of paper when it came to romantic relationships. He hadn't even had the chance to fall in love in his past life before he had been so cruelly betrayed. The things that the original Chu Lien had done to him had become a shadow haunting his heart. It really hadn't been easy for him to set his grudge aside and fall in love with the current Chu Lien. It didn't take long for He Changdi to become dissatisfied with some simple touching. Although his leg was injured, his arms were perfectly fine. The chaise she was lying on had been placed right next to his bed and was at the same level. He pushed himself up to a sitting position and managed to move Chu Lien over to his bed with a little strength. He had been worried that she would wake from his actions, but he soon found out that there wasn't the slightest bit of resistance from her, even when he had her entire person ensconced in his arms. He Sanlang relaxed and tightened his embrace around her. He placed a gentle kiss on her soft lips before shutting his eyes in satisfaction. Although he wanted to do something a little more intimate to her, something that only couples would do, he had just suffered grievous injury after all, so he didn't have that much energy. With his chin resting on the top of her head, He Sanlang slipped back into dreamland with her familiar scent all around him. While He Sanlang was now perfectly content, it was getting uncomfortable for Chu Lien in his tight embrace. Her nerves had been strung tight for the whole day. Later on, she had acted as the doctor's assistant and then stayed up by He Sanlang's side for most of the night. It had always been easy for her to fall asleep in the first place. Since she was so tired, her slumber was even deeper this time. She had been feeling pretty comfortable at first, but she soon felt her body heating up while her nose seemed to be squashed by something. It was all stuffy and hard for her to breathe. Chu Lien finally found it difficult to continue sleeping and opened her eyes, only to be met with the sight of a wall of flesh. She was still a little stunned at first, but she quickly realized what was going on. Her first reaction was to roll her eyes before thinking of pushing away the lunatic He Sanlang. However, when she noticed the various wounds on his chest exposed by his slightly open shirt, she hesitated. The reminder that there was a serious injury on his right thigh came to her mind. In the end, she just softly sighed and let him do as he liked. She wanted to move out of his embrace a little at first, but his arms were wrapped around her too tightly and she couldn't budge him. After trying for some time, she managed to create at least a hand's width of space between them. Finally, Chu Lien reached an impasse, so she gave up on it. She yawned sleepily and shut her eyes to continue her slumber. He Sanlang was her husband anyway. Even if the servants chanced upon them like this, no one would actually be as stupid as to gossip about it outside. It was only after he heard Chu Lian's breathing devolve into long and slow breaths that he Sanlang finally dared to open his eyes and glance at the woman in his arms. When he saw that she was still obediently curled up and sleeping in his embrace, his mind relaxed while a warm feeling spread through his heart. Chapter 425. Taking care of He Sanlang. 4. The next day, when the sun had already risen, it was the sound of winching pushing the doors open that woke Chu Lian. Her eyelids fluttered open as consciousness filtered back into her eyes. This time, she mercilessly forced He Sanlang's arms away from her and crawled out from his embrace. She put on her embroidered shoes and walked over to the screen in one corner of the room to put on her clothes. Chu Lian turned around to glance at the seemingly unconscious He Changdi, and the corners of her lips twitched subconsciously. That fellow had already been awake for who knows how long. He was still pretending to be asleep even now. He really should improve his acting skills, though. His eyelids were twitching from time to time, and his breathing was too heavy for him to be sound asleep. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. When Wenqing entered the room, she was greeted with the sight of a fully dressed third young madam seated on a round stool and waiting for her. Wenqing had brought hot water with her. When her gaze darted towards the neat chaise and then the disheveled bed, she couldn't help the upward curve of her lips. It looked like they could move the chaise away today. They probably wouldn't need it any longer tonight. It was only when Chu Lian had come out from the bathroom that He Sanlang finally woke up with a frown. Chu Lian sat by his bedside and resisted the urge to laugh. "You're awake?" He Changdi looked at her with his deep gaze and nodded in a serious manner. "Too bad. I thought my dear husband was going to continue pretending to sleep. It's still early now. It's only 8 a.m. He Sanlang hadn't expected his dear wife to see through his acting as well as to expose it completely without any care for his dignity. He shifted away his gaze, the roots of his ears flushing red. He pressed his lips into a thin line and said, "Chu Lian, don't speak nonsense." Wenqing's eyes almost fell out of their sockets at this sight. This Tsundra third young master who refused to admit his mistake was a completely different person from the grim and gloomy master she knew. The way third young master was acting now really fit how third young madam had described him once upon a time. Wenqing felt that she had stumbled upon a dangerous truth. She quickly lowered her head and did her best to erase her presence. Third young madam was untouchable, but she wasn't. If third young master realized what she knew, she would have to face the consequences. Chu Lian was too lazy to argue with him now. If he hadn't been pretending to be asleep, why didn't he at least ask what was going on the moment he woke up? "Stay there and rest first. We'll go to the kitchen to see how the preparations for your medicine and our breakfast are going." He Changdi felt extremely embarrassed right now, so he didn't stop Chu Lian from leaving. Today's breakfast was wontons, spring rolls and egg rolls, made by the kitchen staff under Wenlin's lead. In the time it had taken to place all the breakfast dishes on the side table, Chu Lian had already changed into another set of clothes and returned to the room, carrying a bowl of medicine in her hands. Chinese medicine was usually a little harsh on the stomach, so it was better to have some food before taking the medicine. Chu Lian helped He Sanlang up so he could lean against the headboard. Wenlan quickly shifted the side table over to the bedside where He Changdi could easily reach. Looking at the food before him, memories rose to the forefront of He Changdi's mind, distracting him. He remembered that the first breakfast Chu Lian had made for him was wontons. Back then, all he had felt towards her were hatred and contempt, but now he was deeply admired in the blossoming feelings between them. The stark difference in the situations then and now filled him with regrets. Chu Lian was already starving, so she quickly scooped up one of the fat wontons and stuffed it into her mouth. The stuffing in the wontons had been made with only 3 simple fresh ingredients: pork, mushrooms, and shrimp. The wontons had been cooked in a fragrant and thick chicken broth, and chopped spring onions had been scattered on top. When she picked one up and bit into it, the juices within would gush out in a burst of flavor. Mixed with the thick chicken broth, it was a delicious combination that she couldn't stop eating. He Sanlang watched as Chu Lian ate the wontons. Her delicate lips drew close to the spoon, and she blew gently on the wonton before she moved the spoon into her mouth. She then chewed on it as her eyes closed in delight. It was clear that she was enjoying the food a lot. Changdi couldn't help but gulp. When he saw how busy Chu Lian was with eating and how she didn't have the time to care for him, jealousy sprung up in his heart. He purposely put on a grave expression and said, "Is it good?" Chu Lian didn't even bother to glance at him and nodded. "Of course it's good. This is Wenlin's best dish. Even if I made these myself, I wouldn't be able to make the wontons look as nice as when Wenlan does them." With a dark expression, Sanlang gritted his teeth and said, "Really?" Chu Lian finally noticed that something was amiss. She looked at him with a baffled expression. "What's wrong with this lunatic?" Sanlang. Even the delicious wontons couldn't get him to shut up? Chu Lian kind-heartedly pushed the white bowl of wontons closer to him. "Hurry up and eat some. I'm not lying to you. It's really tasty. I taught Wenlan her skills myself." "Well, aren't you generous to others?" Changdi mumbled. Chu Lian raised a brow in silent comment. She didn't know what was going on in her lunatic husband's mind again, and she didn't want to know. She chose to ignore him and focus on eating her fill first. Sanlang hadn't expected Chu Lian to ignore him just because of that. Anger, disappointment, and dissatisfaction rose up in his chest all at once. He kept his frosty gaze on Chu Lian with an overcast and unreadable expression. Nobody could tell what was up with him. Even Wenlan was starting to pity Third Young Madam. Third Young Madam was right all along. Third Young Master is a lunatic. Chu Lian lost her appetite under his gaze. She set down her chopsticks and bowl before staring at Changdi with a frown. She crossed her arms on her chest and questioned in a sharp tone, "Sanlang, what are you trying to do? If you're not going to eat, I'll get Wenlan to clear the table." Seeing that she was truly unhappy with him, Sanlang set aside his pride and finally revealed his true motive. "I'm injured and I can't really move." Chu Lian was smart enough to understand what he was hinting at. Her slightly angry expression turned dazed upon her realization. What? His arms were so strong that he had kept her trapped as his bolster all night. Yet now he's trying to say that he can't even lift a damned bowl now. Did he take her for a fool? TL note. I think you guys know what wontons look like, but have some more pictures. Chu Lian specifically refers to the wontons as 3 delicacies style wontons, which means that they contain minced pork, mushrooms, and shrimp in the stuffing. The description of the juices leaking out got to me, so I had to include some pictures of the juices too. Ho-ho, 3 delicacies wontons, juicy wonton dipped in chili sauce. We need a tasty/delicious reaction, don't we? Chapter 426, Cleansing 1. If it had been any other day, Chu Lian would have just ignored her lunatic husband. However, considering how he was currently her patient and how injured he was, Chu Lian suppressed her rage and forced herself to calm down. She shot a sideways look at Changdi before resigning herself to her fate. She picked up one of the wontons on the side table with her spoon and blew on it before sending it to Sanlang's mouth. Changdi's dark eyes lit up and sparkled like the stars of the night sky. His lips parted and Chu Lian shoved the spoonful of wonton right into his mouth. She thought gleefully to herself inwardly as she looked at Changdi with disdain. There. He could have his fill of wontons. It was obvious that Sanlang's stiff features had softened into a warm expression. He followed Chu Lian's movements closely. Every time she moved the spoon close to him, he would open his mouth obediently. While eating, he didn't forget to add, "It's pretty good, but it's not delicious as the ones you made." Chu Lian rolled her eyes. She felt that Changdi was just lying brazenly. Setting the matter of the taste aside, Wenlan had already surpassed her in the skill of folding the wontons up into their ingot shape. Furthermore, Wenlan had come up with this chicken broth herself after much trial and error. Chu Lian snorted in dismissal, but there was still a trace of warmth in her heart from his words. When Sanlang's band of brothers entered, they were met with the scene of Chu Lian patiently feeding Sanlang. Xiao Hongyu was stunned, and the corners of his eyes immediately turned red. He showed his usual loud personality as he quickly strode towards the bed and wailed, "Brother so it wasn't just your leg that was hurt. Even your hands have been crippled. How can this be? Tell your little brother which damned bastard did this. He'll kill them all." Sanlang's warm expression immediately froze over into his usual cold one. He glared once at the wailing Xiao Hongyu before taking the bowl from Chu Lian's hands and gobbling the rest of the wontons down. Xiao Hongyu watched his movements with a stupefied expression before understanding dawned upon him. He pointed at He Changdis' arms. "Brother He, so your arms aren't injured at all." Following that, his gaze landed upon the awkward Chu Lian, sister-in-law. "Since Brother He's arms are completely fine, you don't have to wait on him. Brother He is actually really tough when he's in our army camp." There was even this one time when, before Xiao Hongyu could finish, he felt an eerily icy gaze fall upon him, which sent a chill down his back. When he looked up, he was met with He Changdis' warning gaze. His voice trailed away and his throat clogged up. He scratched the back of his head and chuckled sheepishly. Captain Gua came up and delivered a smack on the head to Xiao Hongyu. "All right, that's enough nonsense from you. Single brats can go wait over there." Xiao Hongyu held the back of his head and gave off another pitiful wail before going off to one corner to lick his wounds. Zhang Mai shook his head. Bachelors like Hongyu wouldn't understand the little enjoyments shared between couples. Chu Lian ordered Wenqing and Wanlan to clear the table and served tea to their guests. She wanted to leave so that the band of brothers could have some privacy to chat, but He Changdi grabbed hold of her hand and told her to sit at the side. Thus, she had no choice but to stay. As she listened to their analysis of what had happened to Sanlang, Chu Lian was lulled into deep thought. She hadn't expected that it was truly Xiao Bojian who sent those men. Her brows scrunched together tightly, disbelief showing on her face. There was no other reason for there to be any enmity between Xiao Bojian and He Changdi, other than her. Count Jinggan was away guarding the border, so Xiao Bojian couldn't possibly have any interactions or connections with House Jinggan, nor would it benefit him politically to pit himself against House Jinggan. Chu Lian was extremely vexed with the whole situation. She was completely innocent, and she had done her best to avoid Xiao Bojian. However, he was still targeting her even when she was way out here in the north. Is he crazy? Chu Lian didn't know if there was actually something wrong with Xiao Bojian's mind, but she was going to be driven mad by him soon. Captain Gua and the others who had come to visit He Sanlang shamelessly stayed for lunch before leaving. They even cleared out the He Estate's kitchen before they left. Chu Lian took the chance to have some free time to herself when He Sanlang settled in for an afternoon nap. She ordered the servants to summon Manager Qin and had an hour-long meeting with him in the parlor. After getting pointers from his young madam, Manager Qin happily ran off to work on his business. Ever since He Changdis' fever had broken, Chu Lian would accompany him in the side room every day. However, she told the maidservants to move the chaise away from the bedside. When it was time to rest for the night, Chu Lian would return to her own courtyard within the He estate. This was something she didn't budge on even when He Sanlang gave her a long face. Was he joking? The wound on his thigh was still in bad condition and it couldn't be touched right now. If the two of them slept in the same bed, and if Chu Lian were to accidentally kick him in the thigh in her sleep, He Sanlang would really lose the use of his leg. They definitely wouldn't be able to make it back to the capital before the new year now. Even if He Sanlang wasn't injured, snowstorms were still raging all over the north. It would take too much effort to head back to the capital now, even with the snowboats. Furthermore, the report of their victory likely hadn't reached the capital yet, so the northern border army had to remain on standby and await the emperor's orders. It seemed like they would have to wait till after the new year to get any news. Thus, it was already certain that they were going to spend the new year in the north. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.